The hall was already full when Elena walked in. She had not been summoned. She had come on her own, because she felt something pulling at her chest all morning. A tight, breathless feeling she could not explain. She had ignored it through breakfast, through the quiet hour she spent watering the small plants on the windowsill of the room she shared with no one. But by midday the feeling had become impossible to ignore, and so she had put on her jacket and walked the long path from the south quarters to the gathering hall without knowing why. She knew the moment she stepped through the door. The hall was used for announcements that could not wait. Every face she knew, older wolves who had watched her grow up, younger ones who had only known her as Luna, were standing in rows with their eyes fixed on the floor. No one looked at her when she entered. That was how she knew something terrible was already in motion. Darian stood at the front. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders, with dark hair that had started going silver at the temples in the last year. Elena had loved that silver. She used to reach up and touch it on quiet mornings when the world was still, and they were the only two people in it. He had laughed the first time she did it, and called her strange. She had called him beautiful, and he had gone quiet in the way he always did when something touched him, and he did not know how to respond. He was not the same man right now. He was standing the way he stood when he had already decided something, and was only waiting for the moment to say it out loud. His jaw was set. His hands were at his sides, not folded, not clasped, just hanging there, like two things that had forgotten what they were for. He was looking at a point somewhere above the heads of everyone in the room, and Elena understood in an instant that he was not going to look at her. That terrified her more than anything else. Beta Cord stood slightly behind Darian and to the right. Cord was a man with a pleasant face that Elena had never quite trusted. He had thin lips that smiled too easily, and eyes that watched everything with a kind of patient hunger. She had mentioned this to Darian once, early in their relationship, and Darian had laughed it off. Cord was loyal, he said. Cord had been with him since they were boys. Elena had nodded and said nothing more, but she had never fully relaxed in Cord's presence, and she had never been able to explain to herself exactly why. She was beginning to understand why now. Cord had a folder in his hands. It was a plain brown folder, the kind used for official pact documents. He held it with both hands as though it was something precious, and when his eyes found Elena's across the room, he did not look away. He looked at her steadily, almost gently, in the way a person looks at something they have already finished with. Elena placed one hand over her stomach without thinking. She was 4 months along. No one outside of Darian and the pack healer knew yet. They had planned to announce it after the next full moon, at the gathering that was already being organized, with food and music and the kind of joy that comes when a pack knows it has a future. She had been looking forward to it, with a happiness so simple and complete that she had sometimes felt almost frightened by it, the way a person feels when something good seems too solid to last. Darian finally looked at her. The moment his eyes found her face, she felt something go cold inside her. Not cold like winter, cold like a door closing in a room where there had been warmth. He said her name. Just that. Her name. In a voice that was not unkind but was not anything else either. A voice that had already moved past her, and was just now finishing the motion of saying goodbye. Elena Voss. He used her birth name. Not her bonded name, not Luna. Elena Voss, like she was someone he was about to introduce to a stranger. She did not move. She stood where she was, near the back of the hall, and she kept her hand flat against her stomach, and she waited. Cord stepped forward and opened the folder. He produced 3 sheets of paper and held them up so the elders at the front could see them. He spoke in a clear, measured voice, the voice of someone who had practiced this many times. He said that evidence had been discovered. He said that over the past several months, pact territory maps had been shared with outsiders. He said that the location of the eastern watchtowers had been given to a rival clan that had used that information to make 2 border incursions in the previous year. Incursions that had cost the pack 3 injured wolves and a significant stretch of hunting ground. He said that the source of this information had been traced, and that the trace led here. He looked at Elena when he said that last word. The room did not make a sound. Elena felt the world tilt slightly, not dramatically. Not the way it does in stories when the ground falls away and everything spins. It tilted the way a table tilts when one leg is shorter than the others, slowly, quietly, just enough to make everything on it slide. She said, "What?" It was not the right word. She knew it was not the right word the moment she said it. She should have said something stronger, clearer, more certain. But the word that came out was small and confused, because she was small and confused, because nothing that Cord had just said had any connection to anything that was real. She had never shared pack territory information with anyone. She had never been in contact with any rival clan. She had barely left the pack grounds in the past 2 years, and on the occasions she had, Darian had known exactly where she was going and why. She said, louder this time, "That is not true." Cord held up one of the papers. He said her name was on it. He said her signature was on it. He said the communication had been sent from a device that had been found in the storage room adjacent to the room she used for her personal correspondence. Elena stared at him. She had never used that storage room. She barely went into that wing of the building. She had no reason to. She turned to Darian. He was still looking at that point above everyone's heads, still holding his hands at his sides. She looked at his face and tried to find the man who had sat with her on the roof last summer watching the stars, who had held her hand the entire time she was with the pack healer learning about the pregnancy, who had pressed his face into her hair that same evening and said, quietly, against her head, that he had never been this happy in his life. She tried to find him, and she could not. Darian, she said his name directly. She said it the way she had always said it, without a title, without distance. Look at me. He looked at her. And she saw it. The grief was there. It was right there, just behind his eyes, huge and dark and drowning him. He was not cold. He was not empty. He was devastated. But the devastation was the kind that had already made up its mind. The grief of a man who believed he had already lost the thing he was grieving. He believed it. That was the thing that broke her open. Not the accusation. Not the folder in Cord's hands. Not the silence of everyone around her. It was the fact that Darian believed it. She had always thought that if this kind of moment ever came, if someone ever tried to put distance between them, his knowledge of her would be the thing that protected them both. He knew her. He had known her for 6 years. He had seen her in every kind of mood, in every kind of difficulty, at her best and at her most tired and afraid. He knew the way she laughed too loudly at things that surprised her, and went very quiet at things that hurt. He knew she brought small gifts for people when she thought they were struggling, not because she was performing generosity, but because she genuinely could not help it. He knew she kept a worn journal she had carried since she was a teenager, not to write secrets in, but to write down things she found beautiful. Lines from songs, things people said, the color of the sky on particular evenings. He knew her. And he still believed it. That was the moment she understood that knowledge and trust are not the same thing, and that someone can know everything about you and still choose not to trust what they know. The pack elder who stood at the front of the room, a woman named Grace, who had been one of Elena's strongest supporters since the day she arrived, was looking at the documents with a careful, troubled expression. She was not celebrating. None of them were celebrating. But they were not stopping it either. Darian began to speak. His voice was controlled. He had always been good at that, controlling his voice when everything else was falling apart. He said that the evidence had been reviewed by 3 independent witnesses. He said that the pack could not ignore what had been found. He said that the safety of the pack had to be the first consideration, and that no personal relationship could be placed above the well-being of every wolf in Ashwood territory. He said that the bond between them would be formally severed. He said it quietly. He said it looking at her. And she understood, with a terrible clarity, that he had chosen this word, severed, because he thought it was kinder than the alternative. He thought the directness was mercy. It was not mercy. Elena did not cry. She was surprised by this later, when she had time to think about it. She had expected to cry. She had always been someone who cried easily, at books, at music, at the faces of people she loved when they were sad. But standing in that hall, listening to the man she had built her life beside, dissolve everything they were to each other, in a room full of witnesses, she did not cry. She went very still instead. She felt the children move. It was the first time she had felt them move. That particular flicker of motion inside her that the pack healer had told her to watch for. She had not expected it today. She had not expected any of this today. But there it was, 2 small, insistent nudges, one after the other, like 2 tiny voices, reminding her that there were things still here, still real, still worth the effort of staying upright. She put both hands on her stomach. Cord noticed. His eyes dropped to her hands, and then came back up to her face with an expression she could not read. She would think about that expression for years afterward. Whether he knew. Whether he had known when he built his folder of lies. Whether the children had been part of his calculation, or simply something he had decided did not matter. She never found out. Not that night. Darian said that she would be given 1 hour to collect her personal belongings. He said that a pack escort would walk her to the outer boundary. He said that after that she was on her own. He said all of this in the same controlled voice. Elena looked at him one last time. Not with anger. Not yet. The anger would come later, building slowly over weeks like water rising in a sealed room. Right now she looked at him with something closer to sorrow, not for herself, or not only for herself, but for him, for the man standing at the front of that hall, who had just made the worst decision of his life, and who would spend the rest of his years understanding exactly what it had cost. She turned around. She walked back through the doors she had come in through. Nobody stopped her. Nobody spoke to her. The woman who had been their Luna for 3 years, who had learned every name in the pack, who had stayed up through the night with sick members, who had no family nearby, who had mediated disputes and organized the winter supply runs and built the small library in the East Wing that had previously been a storage room. That woman walked out of the gathering hall, and nobody said a word. The evening air was cold. She had not brought a heavy enough jacket. She stood outside for a moment, breathing. The pack grounds spread out around her in the gray early evening light, familiar as her own hands. The path to the south quarters, the old oak at the edge of the training yard that had lightning damage up one side and had somehow survived anyway. The garden she had planted in her first spring here, now overgrown a little because there had been so much else to do. She breathed in and breathed out. Then she went to collect her things. She packed 1 bag. She did not take everything she could have taken. She took the journal. She took the photograph of her mother. She took the small envelope of money she kept in the back of her desk drawer, money she had saved over 3 years from her personal allowance, without any particular plan for it. Money that was now going to be the difference between finding somewhere safe and not finding it. The pack escort, a young wolf named George who had always been polite to her and who now could not meet her eyes, walked with her to the outer boundary in silence. At the line of old stones that marked the edge of Ashwood territory, he stopped. She kept walking. She did not look back, not because she was too proud to, but because she had made a decision in the single minute between feeling those 2 small movements and reaching her room to pack her bag, a decision that was very simple and very total. She was going to survive this. Not just survive it the way a person survives something terrible, by getting through it and carrying the damage forever. She was going to survive it in a way that would matter. She did not know yet exactly what that meant, but she was going to find out. The stones fell behind her. The dark road stretched ahead. She walked. She had approximately $40 and no destination when she passed the boundary stones, and she was aware of both facts with a cold clarity that was almost useful. Fear would have been paralyzing. Calculation was not. She turned the $40 over in her mind, like a set of pieces she had to arrange carefully, and she thought about what she knew, and what she had, and what she needed to do first. She had a name. A rogue healer named Owen Marsh, who worked the border towns between territories, helping wolves who had no pack and no resources. She had never met him, but Grace, the elder who had stood at the front of the hall tonight with that troubled expression, had once mentioned his name in passing, during a conversation about pack health resources. Elena had written it in the margin of a document without knowing why. She had a good memory for names she might need later. It was a habit she had developed early in life, long before she had any reason to think it would save her. The nearest town was 6 miles east. She walked them. She arrived after midnight. Her feet hurt. The jacket was not warm enough. She found a bench outside a closed convenience store and sat on it, and thought carefully about the next 12 hours. She was not going to panic. She was going to be methodical. She was going to find Owen Marsh, or find someone who knew how to reach him, and she was going to establish a safe situation before she let herself feel any of what tonight had done to her. The children moved again. She put her hand flat on her stomach and sat in the cold outside the closed store and let that small, insistent reminder of what was real do its quiet, steady work. 2 of them. She had suspected twins from an early scan that the healer had kept off the formal records at her request because she wanted to be certain before she told anyone. The healer had been kind about it, and discreet, and Elena had been grateful for both. She was more grateful for both now than she could have put into words. They did not know. Cord did not know. Darian did not know. She had not planned it this way. There was no plan. There had been a pregnancy, and a joy, and a future that had all been real until tonight. But sitting on a cold bench in a border town with $40 and one bag and two small lives that were entirely dependent on her choices, Elena understood that what had looked like an accident of timing was actually the only protection she had. No one would come looking for what they did not know existed. She would keep it that way. She sat on the bench until the sky began to lighten. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket, and went to find a phone. Owen Marsh was not easy to find. Elena spent 2 days making quiet inquiries in the border town before anyone would even admit they had heard the name. The people in places like this, between territories, outside pack structures, living in the gap between two worlds, had learned to be careful about what they acknowledged. She understood it. She did not push. She asked gently, waited, and made it clear by her manner and her patience that she was not a threat to anyone. On the evening of the second day, a woman in a laundromat with a small wolf tattoo on the inside of her wrist looked at Elena for a long moment, and then wrote a number on a receipt and slid it across the folding table. Elena called it from a payphone outside a gas station. The man who answered sounded tired and measured, the voice of someone who had learned not to be surprised by the things people called him about. He asked 3 questions. Was she in immediate danger? Was she injured? And how far along was she? He did not ask her name. He did not ask what had happened or which pack she had come from. Those questions could come later, he said, or they did not have to come at all. She told him she was 4 months along, and that she was not injured, and that she was not in immediate danger, provided she found somewhere safe within the next few days. He gave her an address. It took her most of the next day to reach it, a small house on a narrow road at the edge of a town she had never heard of, surrounded by the kind of tired beauty that comes with old trees and unpainted fences, and the sense that time moves a little more slowly here than it does in the rest of the world. There was a light on inside. There were 2 trucks in the yard with mud on the tires. She knocked. Owen Marsh was shorter than she had imagined. He had gray in his beard and steady hands, and the kind of face that carries a lot of experience without looking worn down by it. He looked at her for a moment on the doorstep, taking in the bag, the jacket, the slight angle of her posture that was the unconscious adjustment she had already started making to accommodate the changing weight at her center. He stepped back and held the door open. "Come in," he said. "You look like you've been outside long enough." He did not treat her with pity. She was deeply grateful for this. He treated her with the quiet, practical competence of someone who understood that what she needed right now was not sympathy, but stability. He showed her a small room with a clean bed and a window that faced a yard full of overgrown grass. He told her she could stay until she had a plan, and that there was no timeline on that. He made tea and set it on the table and left her to drink it alone, which was also exactly the right thing to do. She slept for 11 hours. When she woke, she lay very still for a while and let herself feel everything she had not allowed herself to feel since walking out through the pack boundary. She felt it all carefully, the way you would handle something fragile, examining each piece before setting it aside. The grief was enormous. She was not going to minimize it or pretend it was something smaller than what it was. She had loved Darian, with the kind of love that becomes so woven into your daily life that it stops feeling like a separate thing and just becomes the texture of everything. Losing it was not like losing a relationship. It was like losing the air in a room. She felt the grief. She let it be the size that it was. Then she set it aside, not permanently, not in the way of someone who had decided not to feel it. In the way of someone who understood that right now, feeling it was a luxury she could not afford, and who planned to return to it properly when she had the resources to do so. She got up, washed her face, and went downstairs to talk to Owen about what came next. Owen, it turned out, knew a great deal about what came next for women in her situation. Not specifically her situation, the false accusation and the exile and the political machinery of pack leadership, but the practical situation of a woman alone, pregnant, without a support structure, needing to build a life in a hurry. He had helped many people do this. He had a quiet network of contacts, not dramatic or organized, just people who trusted him and who had resources they were willing to share with someone in need. He helped her find a place to stay in the next town over, a small apartment above a hardware store, owned by a man named Arthur who asked no questions and accepted a deposit Elena paid with the last of her $40, plus a small loan from Owen that she promised to repay. Arthur had kind eyes and a dog named something she never quite caught, and he fixed the leaking faucet before she had even unpacked her bag. She found work within a week. It was not glamorous work. She cleaned a medical office 3 evenings a week and helped stock shelves at a grocery store 2 mornings a week. Both jobs paid in cash. Both employers were people Owen knew who understood discretion. She came home tired every night and ate simple food and put her feet up and talked to the children in the quiet of the small apartment, telling them things about the world in a low voice, things she wanted them to know. She told them the names of constellations. She told them how to identify a good person by watching how they treated people who could not do anything for them. She told them about her mother, who had been a fierce and funny woman with strong opinions about tea and weak opinions about keeping her thoughts to herself. She told them about the pack, the real pack, the one below the politics and the hierarchy, the people who had brought her food when she was unwell and who had come to find her when she was sad. She told them those people were real and good, and that the actions of one man and one lie did not change what was real and good about them. She did not tell them about their father, not yet. They were not born yet. But she was already deciding how she would do it when the time came. The months passed. Owen checked in regularly. He was not hovering. He was paying attention, which is different. He came by with extra supplies when the weather turned cold and the drafts in the apartment above the hardware store made the heating less effective. He sat at her small table and drank tea and talked about practical things, her options for the birth, her options after the birth, what kind of paperwork she should get in order, and what she should be careful about. He knew she was from a pack. He did not know which one, and he did not ask. But one evening, after she had been staying in town for about 3 months, he looked at her across the table and said, simply, "Whoever did this to you was a fool." She looked at him. "Not because of what they cost you," he said, "though that's true too, because of who they threw away." She said thank you very quietly and looked at her tea, and he moved on to something else and did not make her respond to it further. That was one of the things she remembered most about Owen Marsh in the years afterward. He knew when to say something, and he knew when to stop. The birth was in early spring. Owen was there. A woman named Carol, who was a retired nurse and part of Owen's network, was there. They were in the apartment, not a hospital. Elena had considered the hospital, but had decided against it, for reasons that were partly practical and partly instinctive. Official records were traceable. People who wanted to find something could find it in official records if they knew what they were looking for. She did not know whether anyone would look. She did not think they would. But she was not going to take the chance. It was a long night. Carol was calm and competent throughout, and Owen kept the tea going and stayed out of the way at the right times and in the room at the right times. By the time the darkness outside was beginning to thin toward morning, Elena was holding 2 boys. They were small and perfect and furious about being born, which she found immediately reassuring. She had already decided on the names, Kale and Riven. She had spent months turning names over in her mind, discarding anything that felt too tied to pack tradition, anything that carried the kind of weight that could be used to trace a bloodline. She had found these 2 in an old book she had picked up at the second-hand shop on the high street, a book of names from older languages, and they had felt right in a way she could not fully explain and did not try to. Kale and Riven, short, clear, strong, names that belonged to nobody but themselves. She held them in the gray early morning light, one in each arm, and she felt something settle inside her. Not peace exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it, a kind of certainty, a sense that the most important things were here, in this room, breathing, alive, warm, hers. She had survived the worst night of her life. She had walked out through a boundary in the dark with nothing and built something from it, slowly and carefully, piece by piece. And now she had these 2 furious, perfect, entirely real reasons to keep building. She looked at Kale's face, which was scrunched up with the effort of being new. She looked at Riven's face, which was already smoother, almost thoughtful. She thought, "You are going to be so different from each other." She thought, You are going to be extraordinary. She thought, I am going to make absolutely certain of it. Owen, from the doorway, said something about getting everyone something to eat. Carol laughed softly. The morning light came through the window of the small apartment above the hardware store and fell across all of them, and for a few minutes, everything was very quiet and very warm. Elena held her sons. The world outside was the same world it had always been, complicated and difficult, and full of people making choices that hurt other people. It was not going to become simpler or kinder, because she needed it to. She knew that. She had known it since she was a child, and had understood it more fully in the past months than she ever had before. But she was still here. They were here, and that was more than enough to start. She had work to do. She had years of work ahead of her. Invisible work, daily work, the work of raising 2 children outside a pack structure without resources or support beyond a quiet network of decent people. She was going to do all of it. She was going to do it without bitterness, or as close to without bitterness as she could manage, because she had already decided that bitterness was something she could not afford. It was too heavy. It would take up space she needed for something more useful. She was going to do the hardest thing any person can do. She was going to rebuild a life not in spite of what had happened to her, but around it, integrating it, making it part of the structure rather than fighting it. She was not going to spend her children's childhood looking backward. She was going to look at them instead. She did, in the growing light of that spring morning, and what she saw there was more than enough. In the weeks that followed the birth, Elena moved with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that every decision she made now was a foundation. She could not afford to make careless ones. She could not afford to move too quickly, or settle too loosely, or choose convenience over safety. She had 2 infants, who needed her to be sharp at all times, and so she made herself sharp, even when she was exhausted, even when 3 in the morning felt like a room with no walls. Arthur, the landlord, turned out to be unexpectedly kind about the babies. He had raised children of his own, 2 daughters who were grown now, and lived far away, and he had a tenderness about small things that surprised Elena the first time she saw it. He knocked on her door one afternoon with a box of things his daughters had left behind: baby clothes, a small blanket, a worn stuffed rabbit that had clearly been loved to its limits. He held out the box and said he thought she might be able to use some of it, and that otherwise it was just sitting. She took the box and said thank you, and meant it more than she had words for. She carried Kale and Riven with her in a double sling she fashioned from 2 long pieces of fabric that Carol showed her how to tie, and she went to work when they were small enough to sleep through it, and later she found ways to manage childcare through the informal networks of the town, mothers who traded hours with each other, retired women who liked babies, a teenage girl named Lily next door, who had a genuine gift for calming them that Elena found quietly astonishing. The town did not ask too many questions. Elena understood that it had probably seen people like her before, people passing through on their way from somewhere difficult to somewhere unknown. It had the quiet kindness of a place that had learned not to press. She was grateful for it every single day. She saved money with a discipline that she would later describe to her sons as the most useful skill she ever developed, not saving dramatically, not punishing herself for any normal expense, but consistently putting something aside every single week without fail, even when it was very small. She kept it in a metal box under the bed, which she knew was not sophisticated, but which was immediate and real, in a way that felt important. She could put her hand on it. She could count it. In a life that had very few certainties, the metal box under the bed was a certainty. She watched Kale and Riven change every day, with the kind of attention that only a parent who is also completely alone can give. There was no one to share the moments with, no one to turn to and say, "Did you see that?" Which meant she saw everything herself, kept all of it, stored it in a part of herself that grew very full very quickly. Kale was serious from the beginning. He had a way of looking at things that was almost evaluative, even as an infant, as though he was deciding what he thought about each new thing before committing to a response. He cried less than Riven, and slept better than Riven, and was calmer in general, in a way that would have been reassuring, except that occasionally Elena would catch him watching her, with an expression so attentive and careful that it made her feel slightly observed. Riven was louder. Riven had opinions about things, about food, about temperature, about whether he was facing the direction he wanted to face, and he communicated these opinions at full volume and at length. But he also laughed first. He was laughing before Cale was, proper laughing with his whole body, at things Elena could not always identify. He laughed at the dog from next door. He laughed at rain. He laughed at the ceiling sometimes in the early morning, in a way that made Elena wonder what he saw there. She loved them so completely that it occasionally frightened her. Not the love itself. She had expected to love them. She had not expected this particular quality of it, the way it removed every other consideration from the room. On her most exhausted nights, when the work and the loneliness and the sheer physical effort of doing everything alone had ground her down to something thin and frayed, she would look at them sleeping and feel the love like a weight pressing her back into herself, like a hand on her back pushing her upright. She was not going to fail them. It was not a thought she had to consciously remind herself of. It was something that had settled into her bones in that gray spring morning when she had first held them, and it did not require maintenance. It was simply true, the way gravity is simply true, operating constantly without any effort on her part. 3 years after the boys were born, she moved again. It was time. The town had been good to her, but she had outgrown what it could offer. The boys needed space, and they needed other children, and they needed a school that could give them the kind of education she had already started to see was going to matter enormously with these two particular people. She found a small city, large enough to be anonymous, close enough to open country for the boys to have room to run, and she moved them there on a Tuesday, with everything they owned, in the back of a rented van that Arthur helped her load. She had paid back every dollar she had borrowed from Owen by then. She had done it in installments, always sending more than the minimum, always with a note that said she hoped he was well. The last note he sent back said, "You were never really in debt to me, you know, but I'm glad you felt the need to be sure." She had laughed at that, alone in her kitchen, and had kept the note in the metal box. She was building something. It was slow and it was often hard, and it did not look like anything from the outside that anyone would call impressive. But she could feel its shape. It had the particular solidity of things that are built correctly from the ground up, taking the time to lay each piece properly before adding the next one. She was in no hurry. She had her sons and her plans and 17 years to work with. She intended to use every one of them. The thing about Darian's guilt was that it did not destroy him cleanly. A clean destruction would have been easier to understand. A man makes a terrible mistake. The weight of it becomes unbearable. He collapses under it. That story has a shape. People know how to navigate it. But Darian's guilt did not follow that shape. It settled into him slowly, like water finding the cracks in stone, and it changed him in ways that were subtle enough that he could sometimes go entire days without fully acknowledging what he had done. He told himself a story. It was not a story he had constructed consciously. It had built itself from the materials available, from the documents Cord had placed in the folder, from the witnesses who had examined them and found them credible, from the fact that the border incursions had been real and the pack had genuinely been hurt by them. He had not invented the evidence. He had only believed it. He told himself that believing credible evidence was not the same as choosing to destroy someone. He almost believed that story most of the time. The months after Elena left were the worst. Not because anything catastrophic happened, nothing did. Life in the pack continued. The administrative functions he was responsible for continued. People came to him with their problems, and their disputes, and their requests, the way they always had, and he dealt with all of it with the same outward competence he had always brought to his role. Nobody who looked at him from the outside would have said he was struggling. The inside was a different matter. He could not sleep well. He had never had difficulty sleeping before, had always been someone who fell into sleep quickly, and woke with the ease of a man with a clear mind. Now he lay awake in the hours between midnight and morning, and thought about things he did not want to think about. The way Elena had looked at him in the hall, not with anger, he could have handled anger. She had looked at him with sorrow, and with something else underneath the sorrow, something that he had been trying not to name for months, but that he understood in the darkest part of the night, was recognition. She had looked at him as though she was seeing something she had always known was there, and had always hoped would not become important. She had not looked surprised. He kept returning to that. She had looked many things in that hall, confused at first, then afraid, then certain, then sorrowful, but she had not looked surprised. And he could not decide whether that meant she had expected this kind of failure from him, or whether it meant she understood him well enough to have known, in that instant, exactly what had happened and why, and had recognized immediately that it was not something she could fight. He hoped it was the second one. He was not sure it mattered. Cord, in the months and years following the exile, positioned himself very carefully. He had always been good at this, at making himself essential without appearing to be engineering his own importance. He had done it with Darian since they were young, inserting himself at the right moments, being available at the right times, making himself the obvious person to turn to, in a way that felt natural rather than calculated. Darian had always known, in the abstract, that Cord was a political creature. He had always told himself that this was a useful quality in a beta, that pack politics required someone who understood the machinery. He had not understood that the machinery could be turned on him. The first year after the exile, Cord was careful. He let Darian's grief play out without pressing any advantage. He was available, supportive, quietly competent. He managed situations before they became problems. He said nothing about Elena unless directly asked, and when directly asked, said very little, only that the evidence had been clear, and that the pack had done what it had to do. He allowed Darian the fiction that it had been a collective decision, a necessary one, rather than something that had been engineered. By the second year, Cord had begun to expand his actual influence in ways that were hard to point to specifically, but unmistakable if you were paying attention. He had relationships with the supply chain contacts that previously ran through Darian. He had built trust with 2 of the 3 pack elders in ways that meant they consulted him before bringing things to Darian. He had a particular dynamic with the younger wolves in the pack, those who had been teenagers during the exile, and for whom Elena was not a real memory, but a cautionary story, that Darian recognized, when he finally allowed himself to recognize it, as the beginning of a generation of loyalty to Cord, rather than to Ashwood leadership. Grace watched all of this. She was old enough and sharp enough to see it for what it was, and she had the courage to say something to Darian in the 3rd year, sitting across from him in his private office with her hands folded on her knees, and her expression one of careful but complete honesty. She told him that Cord was building something inside the pack structure that was not in the pack's interest. Darian said he was not sure what she meant. Grace looked at him for a moment, in the way of someone who is deciding whether to push or let the moment pass. She pushed. She said she had gone back through the original documents from the hearing. She said she was not accusing anyone of anything she could not prove, but she said there were inconsistencies in those documents that she had been thinking about for 3 years, and that she thought he should look at them again with fresh eyes. Darian said nothing for a long time. Then he said he would consider it. He did not look at the documents, not then. He was not ready to look at them, and he understood with an honesty he could not share with anyone that the reason he was not ready was not because he was busy or because he trusted the original verdict. It was because looking at them and finding what Grace was suggesting he might find would mean something he was not yet able to face. It would mean he had been wrong. Not just mistaken, not just deceived, wrong in a way that had consequences he could not undo. He put the documents in a drawer and did not open it. The pack, meanwhile, did what packs do. It adapted. The younger wolves who had grown up under the post-Elena era knew the pack only as it was now, somewhat quieter, somewhat more tightly controlled, with an alpha who led competently but without the particular energy that comes from a leader who is genuinely happy. They were not unhappy themselves. They simply did not know what the alternative had looked like. The older wolves remembered. There was a woman named Barb who had been one of the senior members of the pack for 40 years, and who had known both Darian and Elena well. Barb was not political in any formal sense, but she was the kind of person who held a pack together through the sheer force of her consistency, the one everyone knew to go to when they needed something handled without fuss. She had watched the exile with an expression she had kept carefully neutral during the public hearing, and had said nothing publicly about what she thought. Privately, she thought about Elena every year on the anniversary of the exile. She lit a small candle in her kitchen, and thought about the young woman who had planted the garden in the east wing, and stayed up late to make sure the sick wolves were comfortable, and had known every name in the pack without ever seeming to try. She thought about those things, and she felt a grief that she was not allowed to express officially, because officially, the verdict still stood, and the exile was still justified. She kept her thoughts in her kitchen with the candle, but she did not forget. There were others like Barb. Not many, but enough. A quiet current of people who remembered differently than the official record said they should, who carried a private version of events that was more complicated than the pack's public position. These people did not organize themselves. They did not make any plans. They simply lived with what they knew, continuing in the pack because it was their home, and because leaving was not the answer. Waiting with the patience of people who had lived long enough to know that the truth has a tendency to arrive eventually. It just tends to arrive in its own time, and not necessarily in the form you expected. Cord, unaware of these quiet currents, continued to consolidate. He had a particular talent for identifying which wolves could be useful to him, and then making them feel valued in ways that produced loyalty without ever making an explicit exchange. He never asked for anything directly. He simply showed up, helped, remembered details, noticed things. He was extraordinarily good at being the most useful person in the room, and he had spent 15 years being the most useful person in Darian's room, and the return on that investment was visible in every corner of the pack. Darian's second bond was arranged rather than chosen. Her name was Patricia, and she was from a Pack 2 territories over, the daughter of a senior member who had old ties to Ashwood. The arrangement had been Cord's suggestion, framed as a practical solution to the absence of an alpha pair, with political advantages that Darian could not honestly dispute. Patricia was a capable woman who understood exactly what she was walking into. She came to Ashwood and took up the practical functions of her role, with a quiet efficiency that nobody could fault and nobody particularly celebrated. Darian was kind to her. He was not unkind to anyone. But there was a part of him that had closed after Elena left, and it had not reopened, and Patricia understood this within the first week, and had made her peace with it in the way of someone who had been prepared for it. They were partners in function. They were not mates in the way that word is supposed to mean. They both knew this, and neither of them discussed it. She bore him no children. He did not ask why, and she did not say. There was a silence at the center of that particular subject that both of them respected without ever discussing. Perhaps she understood, in the way perceptive people understand things without being told, that the question of children was connected to a wound she had not made and could not heal. Perhaps she simply had her own reasons that had nothing to do with him. The pack noticed the absence of an heir, but said so only in low voices in private spaces, the way packs talk about things they are not supposed to discuss. The years passed. Darian became, in many respects, a perfectly adequate alpha. The pack was not poorly run. The borders were maintained. Disputes were resolved. The seasonal rotations and supply management and the dozen other practical functions of pack governance continued without obvious failure. If you looked only at the surface, Ashwood was a functioning, stable pack under stable leadership. If you looked closer, you saw a place where the energy had gone slightly flat, where people were loyal to their home rather than to their alpha, where the best young wolves were starting to find reasons to visit other territories and occasionally to stay, where Cord's hand was in more things than was appropriate, and where the older wolves who noticed this had learned not to say so out loud. Where an alpha sat at the head of it all, running it competently, carrying something private and heavy in his chest, and not asking himself the questions that needed to be asked, because he was not yet ready for the answers. He was not a villain. He was something more common, and in many ways harder to sympathize with, a man who had done something wrong, and had built a life around not fully looking at it. The drawer with the documents stayed closed. The world kept moving. And in a city some distance from Ashwood territory, in a small apartment, and then a larger one, and then a house at the end of a street with good trees, two boys were growing up. They were learning things. They were becoming something. They did not know yet what they were becoming, only that their mother had been teaching them with extraordinary care for their entire lives, and that she seemed to be building towards something, steadily and without apparent hurry, the way someone builds a structure they intend to last. The years moved. The boys grew. And the drawer stayed closed just a little longer. Elena had thought carefully about when to tell them. Not whether. The whether had never been a question for her. The truth was not something she intended to keep from her sons. Secrets of that size had a way of doing damage, not because they were secrets exactly, but because they were absences, gaps in the architecture of a person's understanding of themselves, and gaps in architecture are where things break. She had watched people carry unexplained gaps their whole lives. She was not going to give her boys that. The when was the question, and she had thought about it the same way she thought about most important things, practically, with attention to the specific people involved, rather than to general principles. What did she actually know about Kale and Riven? What were they ready for? And when would they be ready for more? She watched them. Kale, at 10, had developed a reading habit that was almost alarming in its breadth and depth. He read everything: history, biography, science, the pack law manuals she had kept from her years as Luna that she had never quite been able to leave behind. He read them not with the enthusiasm of someone who loves reading for its own sake, but with the methodical attention of someone extracting information, building a picture, connecting pieces. He had started keeping a notebook of his own at 9, not a diary, not stories, but what appeared to be a kind of running analysis of things he found interesting or important. She had looked at it once, not secretly but openly, she had asked, and he had handed it over without concern. What she found inside was a 12-year-old's organized notes on pack structure, governance, and historical case studies of leadership failures and successes that he had apparently found in the reference books at the public library. She had handed it back to him and said, very casually, that his research was thorough. He had said, also casually, that he was trying to understand how things go wrong in leadership so he could understand how to prevent it. She had nodded. She had gone to make dinner. She had stood at the stove and thought, not yet, but soon. Riven, at 10, was already physically something that other children were not. He had always been bigger and faster than his peers, but by 10 there was a precision to his movement, a control, that was genuinely unusual. He had started training seriously, not in any formal pack structure, but in a community gym 3 days a week, where a former combat trainer named Sam ran classes for teenagers, and occasionally let Riven join, even though he was too young for the formal program, because Sam said he had never seen a kid with that kind of body awareness, and it would be a waste to wait 2 years. Riven was not reckless. This was important. A physically powerful child without judgment was a different kind of problem. Riven was physical and thoughtful simultaneously, which was rarer and more interesting. He read less than Kale, but he observed more, watching people and situations with a quiet attention that caught things Kale sometimes missed from behind his books. The two of them together were something she did not have adequate words for. They argued constantly, about everything, in the productive way of two people who trust each other enough to disagree fully. They challenged each other's conclusions. They pointed out each other's blind spots. They had not been raised to agree. They had been raised to think, and thinking often meant the collision of two different assessments of the same situation. She watched them argue about a book once. She watched the argument go through 3 full position changes on each side, as new evidence was introduced. She watched them arrive at a conclusion that neither had started with. She thought, these two are going to be extraordinary, and also, I need to tell them soon, because they are already asking questions I am not answering directly, and they have noticed. Kale, the previous spring, had asked her why they had no grandparents. It was not the first time he had asked, but it was the first time he had phrased it this carefully, in a way that made clear he already knew something was missing from the explanation she had always given. She had told him that her mother was gone, which was true, and that his father's family was complicated, which was also true, but was not what he was asking. He had looked at her for a moment, with that evaluative look she knew so well. Complicated how? He had said. In ways I'll explain when you're older, she had said. He had accepted this. He had written it down in his notebook, she was almost certain, under a heading probably labeled something like, Things I Still Need to Find Out. Riven had never asked directly, but she had caught him, on more than one occasion, looking at her face when she didn't know he was watching, with the expression of someone who is measuring the distance between what they are being told and what they suspect is actually true. At 16, Kale had asked again. Older, he had said, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with his notebook in front of him and his pen in his hand. You said you'd tell me when I was older. I think I'm old enough. She had looked at him. Then she had looked at Riven, who had come in from the yard and was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, as though he had timed it, as though they had decided together that today was the day to press this. Perhaps they had. She had taken a long breath. She had said, all right. She had told them to sit down, and for the next 2 hours, she had told them everything. Not the emotional version of it, not the victim's version of it, not the version that centered her own pain. She told them the facts, what had happened, in what order, by whose actions, with what consequences. She told them about Cord. She told them about Darian. She told them about the documents, including the ones she had collected over the years from a few quiet sources that had never been officially gathered into any formal case, but that she had held on to, just in case. The way you hold on to things you know are important, without always being certain what they are important for. She put those documents on the table. She said, "These are yours too." Cale picked them up and read them carefully. His face did not change much. His pen moved across his notebook. Riven sat still and looked at nothing in particular for a while. Then he said, "He believed it. He actually believed it." "Yes," Elena said. "He never checked." "No." Riven said nothing else. He nodded once, to himself, the way someone nods when they have finished constructing something and are satisfied it will hold. Cale looked up from the documents. He said, "What do you want us to do?" And Elena said, "I want you to be ready. Whatever comes from this, I want you to be ready. Not angry, not careless, ready." She looked at them both, at these two young men she had built from the worst night of her life, and she felt something settle inside her chest that had been restless for 17 years. "The rest," she said, "is up to you." Cale's first move was not dramatic. It never would be. That was the thing about Cale that people who underestimated him always got wrong. They expected someone building toward a large thing to announce himself. Cale did not announce. He arrived, quietly, in places he needed to be, and he understood things about those places before anyone realized he had been paying attention. The day after Elena told them everything, he opened his notebook to a fresh page. At the top he wrote, "What do we actually have?" Then he wrote 2 columns. The first was facts, things they knew with certainty, could demonstrate, and could show to someone with authority to act on them. The second was the rest, things that were likely true, or that they suspected, or that they knew in the way you know things without being able to prove them yet. The facts column was short, the rest column was longer. He sat with this for 3 days without making any other moves. He read the documents his mother had kept carefully, twice, then a third time with a pen marking specific passages. He went to the public library and spent a full day reading everything he could find about PAC law, specifically, the sections covering evidence requirements for exile verdicts, the rights of exiled members to appeal, and the legal standing of heirs in PAC leadership challenges. He came home from the library with 12 pages of handwritten notes, and a specific look on his face that Riven, who knew every version of his brother's expressions, immediately recognized. "You found something," Riven said. "Several things," Cale said. He set the notes on the table. He said that PAC law had changed 3 times in the 17 years since Elena's exile, and that 2 of those changes had created specific avenues for reviewing exile verdicts that had not existed at the time of the original hearing. He said that the original documents Cord had presented had been stored in Ashwood's PAC archive, which meant they were theoretically accessible to anyone with a legitimate legal claim to request their review. He said that they were legitimate heirs. Riven was quiet for a moment. "Can we prove that?" he asked. "We can, if we find the right witness," Cale said. "Someone who knew both Elena and Darian and was present at the bond ceremony. Someone who is still alive and who might be willing to confirm bloodline." Riven said, "Grace." Cale looked at him. He had been thinking the same name, but he had not said it yet, because saying it meant acting on it, and acting on it meant reaching toward the PAC, and reaching toward the PAC was a move that could not be undone. "Grace," he agreed. They had heard the name from Elena, once, in the context of the elder who had stood at the front of the hall with a troubled expression, and who had, according to Elena, never quite seemed to believe the verdict, even while she allowed it to stand. Elena had said it neutrally, without asking anything of them about it, simply as a detail in the full account, but both of them had noted it. Reaching Grace required going through channels that were not simple. She was a senior PAC elder and lived on Ashwood territory, which meant any direct contact was a security risk, until they knew more about the current state of PAC politics. Cale spent 2 weeks mapping what he could learn from outside: public PAC records, social media that PAC members maintained, a register of official PAC events that was technically public information. It was Riven who made the first actual contact, not with Grace, but with one of the border wolves, a young woman named Penny, who had grown up in the territory adjacent to Ashwood, and who had connections to the PAC but did not live within its formal structure. Riven had met Penny briefly 2 years earlier at a regional training event, and they had kept loose contact since then, in the uncomplicated way of 2 people who happened to get along but did not have much reason to be in regular touch. He messaged her, asking casually how things were going in the area. She called him back within an hour. She talked for 40 minutes, and most of what she said was information Riven had not asked for, but that answered questions he had been asking himself. She talked about Cord's increasing control over pack resource allocation. She talked about the way senior wolves who had been part of the pack for decades were slowly losing informal influence to a younger cohort that was loyal specifically to Cord, rather than to the pack leadership as an institution. She talked about Darien with a complicated sort of sympathy, saying he was still respected by most of the pack as an individual, but that people had started going around him, rather than to him, for things that mattered. She did not know she was giving them intelligence. She was just talking. Riven listened with the particular quality of attention he had always had, the kind that made people feel genuinely heard, and therefore kept them talking. When she was done, he said it sounded like things had been complicated there for a while. She said yes, for a while. She said sometimes she wondered what would have happened if the Luna situation had gone differently, not pointing at anything specific, just musing, the way people do when they sense a subject is connected to something larger without knowing what it is. He said he did not know much about that. She said that the older wolves in the area talked about it sometimes, that the Luna had been well liked, that some people thought things had gone sideways. He said it was interesting how those things had a way of working out in the end, one way or another. She said she hoped so. They talked for a few more minutes about other things, and then they said goodbye, and Riven put down the phone and went to find Kale. Kale was at his desk. He had papers spread across every surface, and a mug of tea that had gone cold at his elbow. Riven sat down and told him everything Penny had said. Kale listened without interrupting. He made 3 notes. Then he looked at Riven and said, "Cord is more exposed than I thought. He has made himself central to the pack's operation, which means if his foundation cracks, the whole structure is at risk." "For him," Riven said. "For him," Kale agreed. "Not for the pack. The pack will be fine. It will need a transition period, but it has enough solid people in it to hold together." Riven said, "Grace. We need to reach Grace," Kale said. Getting to Grace took another 3 weeks and required a chain of 3 intermediaries, none of whom were wolves, and all of whom knew Owen Marsh. Elena, when they explained what they needed, spent a day thinking about it, and then made 2 phone calls and told them she had arranged for a letter to reach Grace through channels that were private and untraceable. She handed them a plain envelope. She said, "Write it carefully." Kale wrote the letter. He wrote it over 4 drafts, each one cleaner and more precise than the last. He stated who he and Riven were, without any performance of drama about it. He described their bloodline and their connection to Elena. He described the documents their mother had kept, and the specific inconsistencies they had identified in the original evidence. He said they were not asking Grace for anything she was not willing to give. He said that if she was willing to meet with them, they would do so on whatever terms made her comfortable, in whatever location she chose. He said that if she was not willing to meet, they understood, and they did not ask that she do anything she felt was a risk to herself. He said they were not here to cause chaos. They were here because chaos had already been caused, 17 years earlier, and they were here to address it properly. He sealed the envelope. Grace's response came 11 days later, through the same chain of intermediaries. It was a single sheet of paper with 5 words on it. The first 3 were a date and a time. The last 2 were a town name. Riven picked up the paper and read it and looked at Kale. "She wants to meet," he said. "She wants to meet," Kale said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. They did not need to. They had been building toward this for months, and they were both aware that this was the point at which the thing they were doing became something it could not be undone from. Before this, they had been gathering information. After this, they would be in motion. The difference mattered. Kale asked if Riven was ready. Riven said, "Ask me again when we're there." The drive to the meeting took 3 hours. Kale drove. Riven sat in the passenger seat with his arm out the window and watched the landscape change from the city they had grown up in to the territorial borderlands they were now entering for the first time. He had grown up hearing about this landscape from his mother, in descriptions that were careful and detailed and completely free of sentimentality. It looked like what it was, old country, with long sight lines and the kind of quiet that has history in it. Grace was waiting for them in a roadside diner that had probably been exactly the same for 40 years. She was older than Elena had described, Or perhaps just different in person. Smaller, more compact, with white hair pinned up, and hands that rested flat on the table with no fidgeting. The hands of someone who had made peace with a great deal over a long life. She looked at them when they came through the door, and she went very still. Riven saw it, the recognition. It moved through her face in a wave, starting at her eyes, and settling into something that was not quite grief, and not quite relief, but was something in between. They sat down. She looked at Cale. She looked at Riven. She looked at their faces in the careful, attentive way of someone who is confirming something they already knew. Then she said, "Your mother has your eyes. Both of you. Exactly her eyes." She paused. Then she said, "And you have his jaw." The word his sat between them at the table for a moment. Cale said, "We need to tell you some things, and then we'd like you to look at some documents." Grace nodded. She picked up her tea. She said, "Start from the beginning." So they did. She listened for a long time without interrupting. When Cale placed the documents on the table, she put her tea down and picked them up, and read them in the methodical way of someone who has handled official documents for decades, and knows what to look for. She read them once, quickly. Then she turned back to the beginning and read them again, slowly, her finger moving along certain lines. Her expression did not change dramatically, but her jaw tightened once. Her eyes moved back to a particular passage, and stayed there longer than the others. When she finished, she set the papers down carefully, and looked at both of them. "I knew," she said. Cale said, "What did you know?" "Not this," she said. She pressed her fingers against the documents lightly, as though they were something hot. "Not the specifics, but I knew the verdict was wrong. I have known it for 15 years. She looked at the table. "I'm sorry it took someone else finding the proof." Riven said, "What do you need from us to confirm our bloodline officially?" She looked at him. Then she looked at Cale. She said, "I can do it myself. As a senior elder, my testimony carries standing. I was at the bond ceremony. I know Elena's face, and I know his, and I am looking at the two of you, and I know what I am seeing." She paused. "What I need to know is what happens after I confirm it." Cale told her exactly what would happen after. Grace listened. She asked 3 clarifying questions. She did not look frightened. She looked like someone who had been waiting a long time for a reason to act, and was now carefully examining the reason that had arrived to make sure it was adequate. When Cale finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right." She said it the way someone says it when they mean more than agreement. When they mean, "I have decided." When they mean, "This is the thing I am going to do, and I understand what it means, and I am choosing it." Outside the diner, the light was changing. Riven looked out the window at the old territorial road stretching back toward a pack he had never been part of, and felt something shift quietly inside him. Not excitement, not fear, but something more precise than both of those. The particular feeling of a door that has been locked for a long time, beginning, very slowly, to open. He turned back to the table. There was work to do. Grace paid for the tea. Cale tried to, and she waved him off with the brief firmness of someone accustomed to not being argued with. They stood in the parking lot of the diner in the pale afternoon light, and talked for another 20 minutes about logistics. Not what they were going to do, which had been settled inside, but how, and in what order. Grace had opinions. Strong ones, delivered without preamble. She had been watching the inside of Ashwood's leadership structure for 15 years, and she knew its pressure points the way you know the structure of something you have studied for a long time. She knew which elders were genuinely independent, and which ones Cord had gradually turned into allies. She knew which members of the pack had influence that was informal but real, people like Barb, who had never publicly questioned the exile but who commanded deep respect from the older generation. She knew the timeline of Cord's expansion, the specific moments when he had moved from useful to concerning, and the way that Darian's grief had functioned as cover for all of it. She told them all of this in a clear, organized way, without drama. She was the best kind of source, someone with inside knowledge and genuine motive who was also entirely unsentimental about it. Cale wrote for most of her talking. Riven listened. When she finished, she looked at them both again, with that steady, appraising look. She said, "You're going to need to move quickly once you start. Cord watches for anything that looks like a threat. If he gets warning before you're ready, he will act first. Riven said, "We know." She looked at him. She said, "And you're going to need to do this in a way the pack can accept. Not just legally, emotionally. These are people who have been told a story for 17 years. Even the ones who doubted it have been living inside it. You can't just come in and reverse everything and expect the whole structure to adjust overnight." Farrell said, "We understand." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded, once, and got into her car. They watched her drive away. Riven said, "She's going to be good at this." "She already is," Cale said. They drove back in the evening light, both of them quiet with the weight of what had just been made real. Cale had a new section in his notebook now, written in the shorthand he had developed over years of dense note-taking, and it held the bones of a plan that was no longer theoretical. Riven drove for the last hour, and let the road do the work of organizing his thoughts, the same way he had always used physical movement to process the things he was working out. They pulled up outside the house at 9 in the evening. The light in the kitchen was on. Their mother was at the table with a book and a mug of tea, the same image from their entire childhood, the image that had always meant home. She looked up when they came in. She looked at their faces, reading them the way she had always read them, with the particular fluency of someone who had been paying close attention for 17 years. She said, "Grace said yes." It was not a question. Cale said, "Grace said yes." Elena looked at her book, she looked at her tea, she looked at the table. Then she said, very quietly, "Good." Riven sat down across from her. Cale sat beside him. None of them spoke for a moment. The kitchen was warm and quiet. Outside, the street sounds were the ordinary sounds of an ordinary neighborhood on an ordinary evening. In here, something had changed. A direction had been chosen, a course had been set, and the three of them sat with it together, in the way that families sit with large things, not needing to fill the space with words. Riven was the one who finally spoke. He said, "We're going to be careful, Mum." She looked at him. The word she had given them both when they were very small, the English word that she had chosen for its warmth, that they still used even now, when they might have been expected to move away from it. She said, "I know you will." She said, "Both of you." She looked at them each in turn, and there was something in her face that was difficult to describe. Not relief exactly, and not pride exactly, though both were there. It was something that had been held in tension for a very long time, beginning, at last, to release. She picked up her book. She did not go back to reading it. She simply held it, and sat with her sons in the warm kitchen, and let the evening do what evenings do. Tomorrow, the work would continue. Tonight was enough to simply be here, all three of them, in a place that was safe, and chosen, and theirs. The road ahead was long, and would require every skill they had accumulated between them. There would be moments that required perfect timing, and moments that required patience, and moments that required the kind of nerve that only comes from being absolutely certain that what you are doing is the right thing. They were certain. And that, Cale thought, looking at his notebook on the table, and his mother in her chair, and his brother across from him, was a kind of advantage that no amount of money or political positioning could buy. They knew what they were doing, and they knew why. That was more than enough. Riven's reputation arrived in Ashwood territory before he did. It came through the networks that wolves have always maintained. Informal, fast-moving. The kind of information that passes from training ground to training ground without any official channel. It came as fragments at first, a name that had started appearing in regional competition results. 2 wins, then 3, then 5, against opponents who were older and established, and not accustomed to losing. A fighting style that people who saw it described in slightly odd terms, not because it was flashy, it was not flashy at all, but because of the economy of it, the sense that whoever this young wolf was, he never wasted a movement, and never lost his composure, and that combination was genuinely unsettling to face. Within the pack, this information was received the way packs receive most external information, with interest but no urgency. Names came and went. Young wolves made reputations in the regional circuits all the time. There was no particular reason to connect a name to anything closer to home. Cord, however, was not most of the pack. He heard the name the same way he heard most things, through someone who reported to him, one of the younger wolves he had cultivated over years, who had taken to funneling him information on the understanding, never explicitly stated, that this was how you stayed in Cord's good standing. The wolf who brought the name did so without any sense that it was significant. He mentioned it along with 3 other pieces of news, one of which was considerably more urgent. Cord filed the name and moved on. He would think about this choice later. Cale, meanwhile, was doing what Cale did best, building relationships in the spaces nobody watched carefully. He had started making contact with Ashwood pack members who existed at the edges of the formal structure, people who had left the territory years ago but maintained family connections, people who worked in professional capacities adjacent to the pack, people who had never formally joined but had grown up around the culture. These people were not political figures. They were not influential in any obvious sense, but they were connected to the pack in ways that ran deeper than formal membership, and they carried knowledge and relationships that official channels did not access. He was meticulous about how he made these contacts. He never lied about who he was. He presented himself honestly as someone who had strong connections to Ashwood's history and who was researching certain aspects of the pack's recent past. He was warm, but not effusive, patient, but not slow. He built trust the way you build anything that needs to last, one piece at a time, in order, without rushing the structure before its foundations were solid. 3 months after the meeting with Grace, he had built a quiet network of 17 people who would speak to him, who had information he needed, and who were beginning to understand, without him pressing this point, that something was in motion that they might want to be adjacent to. Among them was a man named Philip, who was a retired pack archivist. Philip had managed Ashwood's official records for 20 years, before retiring to a cottage 40 minutes from the pack grounds. He was in his 70s, had a sharp memory, and harbored a specific grievance about the original exile verdict that he had never had the opportunity to act on. That grievance was about the archive. Philip had been responsible for filing the original evidence documents in the archive after the hearing. He had filed them as he was required to, but he had also noticed, in the process of filing them, that one of the 3 documents bore a formatting inconsistency that was not consistent with the pack's communication logs from that period. The date stamp format was wrong. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have been obvious to a non-specialist, but wrong in the precise and specific way that would be obvious to someone who had spent 20 years working with official pack documents. He had noted this to Cord at the time. Cord had told him it was a known variation in the communication system that had been in place during that period, and that it was not relevant. Philip had accepted this. He had been less senior then, and Cord had been persuasive, and the hearing was over and the verdict was delivered, and there had seemed to be no avenue for pressing the point even if he had wanted to. He had thought about it for 17 years. When Cale came to him through a mutual contact and asked, quietly and politely, whether Philip had ever been involved with the archive during the period in question, Philip had said yes. When Cale asked whether he had observed anything in the original documents that had given him pause, Philip had been quiet for a long time. Then he had said yes, when Cale placed the copies of the documents on Philip's kitchen table and asked him to look at them again with fresh eyes. Philip had put on his reading glasses and been quiet for even longer. When he looked up, he said, "The date stamp format on this one is wrong." Cale said he had thought so. Philip said, "I told Cord, at the time." Cale said he knew. Philip looked at him. He said, "Who are you, exactly?" Cale told him exactly who he was. Philip sat with this for a moment. Then he said, "I'll provide a written statement, formally, as a qualified archivist, identifying the inconsistency and dating it to the original evidence set." He paused. "I should have done it 17 years ago." Cale said, "You're doing it now." Philip made tea. They sat at the kitchen table, and Cale walked him through the formal statement requirements for a pack law challenge, which he had memorized some weeks earlier. Philip wrote the statement in his careful, clear archivist's hand. He signed it. He dated it. He held it out to Cale. "Make this count," he said. "It will count," Cale said. He drove home with the statement in an envelope on the passenger seat, and when he reached the city, he drove past the house and went to a copy shop and made 4 copies, which he stored in 4 separate locations. He was not being paranoid, he was being methodical. Things that existed in only one place were vulnerable in ways that things distributed across multiple locations were not. He had learned this from his mother. Riven, during this same period, had begun appearing at the edges of Ashwood territory in ways that were technically within the rules, but unmistakably intentional. The regional training circuits had brought him to towns adjacent to pack grounds, twice in the previous month. He had not stepped onto formal pack territory, but he had been visible, and visible was the point. He had also won 3 more matches. The wolf who beat him was supposed to have won, according to everyone who had seen them both before. He was a senior wolf, named Derek, who had been competing for 15 years, and who was genuinely very good. The match lasted 11 minutes. At the end of it, Derek was on his back looking at the ceiling, and Riven was standing with his arms at his sides, breathing normally, looking at a point in the middle distance, with the expression of someone who had completed a task and was now thinking about the next one. Derek, afterward, sat up and looked at Riven for a moment. He said, "You train alone?" Riven said, "Mostly." Derek said, "Who's your mother?" The question surprised him. He looked at Derek. Derek said, "I'm serious. You fight like someone who was taught, by someone who was very good. The way you hold your center. Most young wolves, they fight from their arms. You fight from somewhere lower. That gets trained into you. It doesn't just appear." Riven said his mother had taught him when he was small. Derek said, "She pack trained?" Riven said, "She had been." Derek said, "From where?" Riven smiled, just slightly. He said he was not quite ready to answer that yet. Derek looked at him for a long moment, with the expression of someone who is recognizing the texture of a situation they cannot quite identify. He said, "All right," he said, "but I want a rematch when you are." Riven said, "You'll get one." Derek turned out to be one of the pack's most respected senior members, not politically, not in the way of someone with formal authority, but in the way of someone who has been around long enough and is good enough at what they do, that people listen when they speak. His words in the training community carried weight, and in the days after that match, his words about Riven, about the quality of what he had seen, about the precision and the composure, and the thing that was difficult to name, that sat underneath both of those qualities, moved through the circuit quickly. People started paying attention. Inside Ashwood territory, the name began to connect to questions. Questions are never comfortable for people who have built things on information being controlled. Cord, when the name reached him a second time, now attached to Derek's specific assessment, now connected to a regional circuit that had wolves from every nearby pack talking, gave it his full attention for the first time. He made some inquiries. He found a name. He found an approximate age. He found a physical description. He did not yet find the connection he was looking for, but he was looking. Kale knew he was looking. Grace had a source inside the pack who moved information to her in a way that was careful and slow and entirely untraceable, and Grace moved it to Kale in pieces, using Owen Marsh's network as the relay. The information arrived days late and in fragments, but it was enough to tell Kale the current state of Cord's awareness, and what he was and was not yet focused on. He was not yet focused on the archive. He was not yet aware of Philip. And he was not yet aware of the 16 other people who had been quietly building a structure around him for 3 months, or the documentation that had been gathered, or the statement from an accredited archivist that was currently sitting in 4 separate locations, ready to be assembled into a formal legal challenge. Cord had spent 17 years being the most informed person in any room. That era was coming to an end. Kale looked at his notebook. He turned to the page where he had written, "What do we actually have?" The first column, facts, things they knew with certainty, could demonstrate, could show to someone with authority to act, had grown considerably. It was no longer short. It was 3 pages, dense and organized, with cross-references, and a list of witnesses, and a packet of supporting documents that had been built piece by piece over months of careful, quiet work. He read through it from the beginning. Then he turned to a new page. At the top he wrote, "It is time." And then he wrote down exactly what happened next. The request for an emergency elder review arrived at Ashwood's formal administrative address on a Thursday morning, delivered by registered mail from a legal representative whose name no one at Ashwood recognized, which was by design. Kale had found the representative, a woman named Frances, a specialist in interpack law who had no prior connection to Ashwood, and therefore no reason for Cord to have flagged her, through Philip, who had worked with her on an unrelated case years before. The request was formal, precise, and bulletproof. It invoked a specific provision of the pack law revisions from 12 years earlier, a provision that Kale had found in the library 3 months ago, and had since memorized with the same completeness with which he memorized everything that mattered. The provision allowed for an independent elder review of any exile verdict in which new evidence could be presented, indicating that the original evidence had been materially compromised. It required a minimum of 3 independent elders from outside the originating pack structure to form the review panel. It required those elders to be impartial. The request named the case, named the date of the original verdict, and identified the claimants as 2 direct heirs of the exiled party, whose bloodline had been confirmed by a senior elder of the relevant pack. It attached Philip's statement. It attached the copies of the original documents with specific notations on the date stamp inconsistency. It attached Grace's formal bloodline confirmation. It attached 9 other supporting statements from people who had observed, at the time or afterward, specific details that were inconsistent with the original verdict. It was 42 pages of careful, organized, completely airtight documentation, and it arrived on Ashwood's administrative desk on a Thursday morning while Cord was in a meeting about supply routes. The administrative wolf who received it was a young woman named Kara, who had been in the role for 2 years and who had never seen anything like it. She read the cover letter twice. She looked at the 42 pages. She did not put them on Cord's desk immediately. She put them on the senior elder's desk, as protocol required for any formal legal correspondence, which was also by design, because Cale had read the Ashwood administrative protocol document, which was technically public information, and had confirmed that this category of document went to elder review before executive review. The senior elder in question, a man named Harold, read the cover letter and then the first 10 pages before he stopped. He sat very still for a moment. He picked up the phone. He called Grace. Grace, who had been expecting this call for 3 weeks, answered on the second ring. The conversation was brief. Harold said, "Grace, tell me about this." Grace said, "I'll tell you everything. But first, are you going to read all 42 pages, or do you need me to tell you where to start?" He said, "Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." She talked for an hour and a half. Harold, who was 72 years old and had been in pack governance his entire adult life and had seen many things in that time, was quiet for a long moment when she finished. Then he said, "And the boys, you've met them." "I've met them," Grace said. "And?" Grace thought for a moment. She said, "Harold, they are the most purposeful young people I have met in a very long time." Harold was quiet again. Then he said, "Get the review panel organized. Use Elaine from the Northern Territory and Peter from the West. They're both independent, and they both have standing." A pause. "And Grace, do it fast, before this gets any messier than it needs to be." Grace said she would. Cord found out about the legal filing not from his administrative source, but from a phone call he received from one of his contacts in the legal community, who had seen Francis's name on a pack law filing and had mentioned it in passing because Francis was known to him. He was told what it related to. He was told the scope of the documentation attached. He sat in his car outside the meeting he had just left, and he thought. He thought for a long time. He was not a man who panicked. Panic was the response of someone who had not accounted for failure in their original planning. Cord had always accounted for failure, or he had always believed he had. He had run the variables many times over the years, in the quiet moments when he allowed himself to check the structure of what he had built and assess its integrity. He had always found it solid. The evidence was gone, in the sense that the original materials had been destroyed after the hearing, and only the copies in the archive remained. There were no witnesses to what he had actually done, or so he had believed. Elena was gone. There had been no children, as far as anyone knew. He had, it appeared, been wrong about the children. He thought about this carefully, without emotion, the way he thought about all problems. It changed things, but it did not necessarily change everything. A bloodline claim was significant, but bloodline alone was not a verdict. They still needed to prove the original evidence was fabricated, and the original evidence was in the archive. He needed to get to the archive. He started the car. He drove to the pack grounds. He walked through the building with the steady, purposeful gait of a man who belonged there, who had always belonged there, who was simply going about his normal business. He went to the archive room. He opened the door. The document boxes were where they always were, organized by year and case type. He found the box for the relevant year. He opened it. He found 7 folders, in order, for all the cases reviewed that year. The folder for Elena's case was present. It was empty. He stood very still and looked at the empty folder. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about the fact that Philip had had access to this archive for 20 years before retiring, and about the fact that Philip had asked him, at the time, about the date stamp formatting. He thought about Grace, and about what Grace might have been doing with certain pieces of information over the past several months. He thought about what a 42-page legal filing looked like and what it required to construct. He thought about the boys he had not known existed. He closed the folder. He put it back in the box. He closed the box. He replaced it on the shelf. He walked out of the archive room. In the hallway, he encountered Barb, who was walking in the other direction, with a stack of folders of her own. She stopped when she saw him. She looked at his face, in the brief instant before he had arranged it back into its normal configuration, and then she looked away. "Cord," she said, pleasantly, moving past him. "Barb," he said. He kept walking. Barb stopped at the archive door and watched him go. She had known this man for 17 years. She had watched him for 17 years, with the careful attention of someone who distrusted him but could not prove it. She had watched him build and consolidate and position himself, watched Darien diminish in his wake, watched the pack become something quieter and more controlled than it had been. She looked at his back as he turned the corner. She thought, "It is moving." She thought, "Finally." She went to find Harold. The Elder Review panel convened on a neutral site. This was standard practice for high-stakes reviews. Taking the proceeding away from the territory in question reduced the possibility of procedural interference and gave the proceedings the independence that their findings would need to carry official weight. The site chosen was a conference facility in a small city that was equidistant from 3-pack territories, the kind of neutral, featureless venue that had no associations with anyone present and therefore gave no one a home advantage. Cale had known the location 3 days before the formal notification arrived, through Grace, and he had used those 3 days productively. He had visited the facility. He had walked through the layout. He had thought about sight lines and seating arrangements and the order in which evidence would be most effectively presented. He had made notes. He had organized the 42 pages of documentation into a presentation sequence that moved from the most incontrovertible factual evidence to the more complex contextual material, building a case that a panel of experienced elders would be able to follow, and that would foreclose objections rather than invite them. He had done all of this with the same unhurried attention he brought to everything. He was not nervous. He recognized the absence of nerves in himself and examined it briefly, because he was always curious about his own internal states. He found that the absence of nerves was not the absence of feeling, but rather the particular focus that comes when something you have been working toward for a long time finally arrives at the moment of being real. He felt clear. He felt present. He felt exactly ready. Riven, on the morning of the review, ran 5 miles before breakfast and did not say much. This was his version of the same thing. Elena did not come to the hearing. This had been Cale's decision, made after a long conversation with her and Grace both. The decision was not about keeping her away from something that was hers. It was entirely hers. She had the most right of anyone to be present. It was a strategic decision about what would serve the proceeding best. An elder review panel examining evidence of a wrongful exile would find it easiest to reach their conclusion on the evidence alone, without the additional emotional weight of the exiled party being present. Her presence would change the room in ways that Cale could not fully control. The evidence in the 42 pages did not need her there to make its case. He wanted nothing in the room that could distract from the documents and the testimony. She had agreed, after thinking about it. She had said he was right and had meant it. She had also said that after it was done, whatever the outcome, she expected a full account. He had said she would have it within 24 hours. The panel of 3 elders arrived first. Elaine from the Northern Territory was a precise, compact woman in her mid-60s, who said very little in the opening moments and gave nothing away with her expression. Peter from the Western Territory was older, perhaps 75, and moved slowly, but listened with an alertness that was immediately apparent. Harold from Ashwood completed the panel. He had the slightly pained expression of a man who was aware that his own pack was about to have its institutional behavior examined in a formal setting, and who had decided, with visible effort, that doing the right thing outweighed the discomfort of this. Frances, the legal representative, sat beside Cale and Riven. She had a calm that came from professional confidence, and a briefcase so organized that everything in it could be found in under 10 seconds. Cord arrived separately, with a legal representative of his own, a younger man named Neil, who wore an expensive suit and the look of someone who had been briefed quickly, and was managing the gap between what he had been told and what he was now looking at. Cord himself sat very still in his chair, with his hands flat on the table, and his face arranged into an expression of mild cooperation. He looked like a man who had decided to appear unbothered, and was succeeding, which told Cale quite a lot about him. Darian was not present. He had been formally notified, as the alpha under whose authority the original verdict had been issued, but attendance was not mandatory for the defending party in this category of proceeding. Cale had thought about Darian's absence and had decided it was probably better. He was not ready to think too much about Darian yet. That was a different matter, for a different day. The proceeding began. Elaine opened it. She stated the purpose and the scope. She stated that the panel was independent, and that its findings, if supported by the evidence, would carry mandatory standing under the current PAC law framework. She stated that all testimony given was binding and that the proceedings were being recorded by 2 independent recorders. She said, "We will begin with the documentary evidence." Frances stood. She presented the 42 pages in the sequence Cale had designed, speaking clearly and without embellishment, pointing to specific passages when necessary, and allowing the panel to read at their own pace. The panel read carefully. There were no interruptions during this phase. Cord's representative made one notation on a legal pad, and then was still. The date stamp inconsistency was the first truly visible shift in the room. Harold, when Frances indicated the specific formatting error and explained its significance, looked at the document for a long moment and then looked at Cord. Cord's face did not change, but his hands, which had been flat on the table, moved very slightly. Cale noticed. He wrote one word in his notebook, which was, "now." Philip testified next. He was 73 years old, and he had spent 20 years in an archive, and he spoke with the particular authority of someone who has a very specific form of expertise and knows it completely. He described the formatting protocols used in official PAC communications during the period in question. He described the exact inconsistency in the evidence document. He described the conversation he had had with Cord at the time of filing, in which Cord had dismissed the inconsistency as a known variation. He described the reason he had not pressed the matter further, and he described it honestly and without excuse. He had been less senior, the verdict was concluded, and he had not had the confidence to push back against someone more powerful than himself. He said he had been thinking about it for 17 years. He said he was here now. Neil, Cord's representative, attempted a cross-examination. He suggested that variations in communication formatting were common, and did not necessarily indicate fabrication. Philip said that was true in general, but that the specific variation in this document was one he had never encountered in 20 years of archive work with that communication system, and that he had specifically flagged it to Cord at the time. Neil did not have a follow-up to this. Grace testified next. Grace was extraordinary to watch. She was 78 years old, and she sat in the witness position, with the absolute ease of someone who had been in difficult rooms for 50 years, and who found that nothing about difficult rooms frightened her anymore. She confirmed the bloodline. She confirmed what she had observed at the bond ceremony. She confirmed that she had harbored reservations about the original verdict since its conclusion, and described the specific observations that had given rise to those reservations. She described Cord's increasing influence over PAC governance in the years since. She was precise and thorough and unshakable. Neil attempted a cross-examination with her too. He suggested that her current testimony was influenced by her relationship with the claimants. Grace said that her current testimony was informed by 17 years of watching the inside of Ashwood governance, and that she had reached every conclusion in it long before she had met either Cale or Riven. She said that meeting them had confirmed her existing conclusions rather than creating them. Neil said nothing further. 7 more witnesses testified, one after another, in the sequence Cale had designed. Each one added a piece to the picture. Not all of them were individually definitive. Some were corroborating context rather than hard evidence, but together, they built a structure that was difficult to argue against, because the pattern was too consistent and too independently arrived at to be explained by coincidence or coordination. Cord was given the opportunity to respond. He declined. Neil said on his behalf that they reserved the right to submit a written response within the allotted time frame under the procedural rules. Elaine said that was their right. The panel took a recess. During the recess, Riven stood by a window and looked out at the parking lot. Cale sat at the table and wrote in his notebook. Frances reviewed her documents. Cord left the room with Neil. They were gone for the entire recess. When the panel returned, Elaine's expression had changed in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. Not warmer exactly, but more settled. The expression of someone who has looked at something from all the angles they need to look at it from, and who has reached a conclusion. She said, "The panel has questions for the claimants." Cale and Riven both sat forward. The questions were good. They were the questions of people who were taking this seriously, and who wanted to understand not just the facts, but the intentions behind what they were looking at. Elaine asked why the claimants had pursued this through formal legal channels, rather than approaching Ashwood leadership directly. Cale said that approaching Ashwood leadership directly would have required trusting that Ashwood leadership was capable of impartially assessing evidence that implicated one of its senior members, and that the evidence they had gathered about how Ashwood's internal structures had operated over the past 17 years gave them no confidence that this would be the outcome. Peter asked whether the claimants intended to seek financial restitution from the pack. Cale said no. He said that financial restitution was not, and had never been, the objective. He said the objective was a formal reversal of the exile verdict, the removal of the member who had engineered the original fraud, and structural guarantees that would prevent this kind of thing from happening again. Harold asked, quietly, whether the claimants had any communication with Darian directly. There was a pause. Riven said, "Not yet." Harold looked at him. Something in his expression shifted, just slightly. He said, "Thank you." The panel closed the formal session. The wait for the finding was 3 hours. Cale and Riven sat in a small room adjacent to the main hall. Frances brought coffee. Nobody talked much. Riven put his feet up on a second chair and closed his eyes. Not sleeping, just resting with the particular ability he had always had, to be still when stillness was required. Cale read through his notebook from the beginning, not because he needed to review anything, but because he had always thought better with a pen in his hand, and the pen gave him something to do that did not consume the attention he was keeping available for what came next. When the panel reconvened, the room felt different. Elaine placed a document on the table. She did not read it aloud immediately. She looked at both Cale and Riven, and then she looked at Cord, who had returned with Neil, and who was sitting in exactly the same position he had sat in all morning. She said, "The panel finds in favor of the claimants on all primary counts. The documentary evidence is materially compromised. The original verdict cannot stand. The exile is formally vacated." She paused. She said, "The panel further finds that the evidence indicates intentional manipulation of official documents by Beta Cord, and refers this finding to the appropriate governance bodies for disciplinary action." The room was very quiet. Cord stood up. He did not speak. He stood, and he looked at the panel, and he looked at Cale, and then he picked up his jacket from the back of his chair, and walked out of the room. Neil watched him go. He looked at his legal pad. He made a notation that no one could see from across the table. Riven watched the door close behind Cord. He said nothing. He breathed out, slowly, through his nose. He turned to Cale, who was writing something in his notebook with the same calm attention he brought to everything. Cale finished writing. He looked up. "One down," he said, very quietly. Riven said, "One down." They shook hands with Frances, who allowed herself a small but genuine smile. They thanked Harold individually, who said that he was sorry this had taken 17 years, and that he meant it. They shook hands with Elaine and Peter, who were professional and gracious, and who both, in their different ways, seemed to be looking at the twins with something that was not quite curiosity, and not quite admiration, but was somewhere between the two. Outside, in the parking lot, the afternoon light had the late gold quality of early autumn. Riven unlocked the car. Cale got in the passenger seat. Riven drove. Neither of them said anything for the first 20 minutes. They did not need to. The silence between them was not empty. It was full, dense with everything the day had been, and everything that was now coming next. They had known this was likely to work. They had built something that was designed to work. But knowing a structure is sound before you put weight on it and watching it hold the weight, are different experiences, and they were both absorbing the difference. Cale said, "We need to call Mum." Riven said, "I know." He pulled over at a gas station. Cale got out and made the call. He was on the phone for 6 minutes. When he came back to the car, his expression was the same as always. Clear, attentive, the expression of someone who is thinking about the next thing. But there was something else underneath it, something that Riven recognized because he felt it too. A deep and quiet satisfaction of a particular kind. The kind that comes not from winning, but from having been entirely right. "She said she knew," Cale said. "Of course she did," Riven said. He pulled back onto the road. Ahead of them, the territory they had never belonged to was waiting. The road was long. There was still so much to do. But the door was open now, all the way. The formal finding hit Ashwood Pack grounds the following morning. Harold had called ahead, not to Cord but to Darien directly, the evening before. It was the first extended conversation the two of them had had in some time. Harold said afterward, to Grace, that he had not been sure what to expect from Darien when he delivered the news. He had prepared for several possible responses: anger, denial, the deflection that powerful people sometimes use when confronted with things they do not want to engage with directly. What he got was silence. A long, specific silence that Harold had interpreted, because he had known Darien for 20 years and had watched him carry something heavy for all of them, as the silence of a man hearing out loud the thing he had been saying quietly to himself for a very long time, and had been hoping would not turn out to be true. He had said, "Darien, are you there?" Darien had said, "Yes." He had said, "Do you need time?" Darien had said, "No." And then, after another silence, "How long have you known this was likely?" Harold had been honest. He said he had had suspicions for years. He said Grace had pushed harder. He said the boys had done the actual work. Darien said, "The boys." Harold waited. Darien said, "Are they?" He stopped. He started again. "What are they like?" Harold said he had only observed them briefly, in the formal context of the proceeding. He said they were exceptionally capable. He said the older one organized information like someone who had been doing it his whole life. He said the younger one was, and here Harold paused, looking for the right word, present, in a way that very few people were, that he was the kind of person who occupied the space he was standing in completely. He said, "They are very much their mother's sons." Another silence. Darien said, "And mine." Harold said, "Yes, and yours." The following morning, the formal documentation of the Elder Panel's finding was delivered to Ashwood's administrative office. Kara, who had started all of this by correctly routing the original filing to the Elder's desk, received this second document with a composure that suggested she was becoming accustomed to receiving papers that changed things. The news moved through the pack in the particular way that significant news always does, not in an orderly top-down announcement, but in the organic, complicated, overlapping way of information that people already suspected and were now being given permission to discuss. People who had said nothing in 17 years began saying things. People who had told themselves the verdict was probably right began telling themselves something different. The conversations happening in hallways and kitchens and training yards were not celebratory. It was not that kind of moment. They were more like the conversations that happen when something that has been out of alignment for a long time is finally being addressed. Conversations that are partly about the specific situation and partly about the accumulated discomfort of having lived with the misalignment. Barb organized a quiet meeting of the senior pack members, not a formal meeting. She did not have the authority to call a formal meeting. An informal gathering, in her kitchen, with 12 people who had been around long enough to understand context, and who trusted each other to be honest. She said they needed to discuss what came next, because what came next mattered enormously, because how the pack handled the transition would determine what kind of pack it became on the other side of it. They talked for 3 hours. Cord, in the meantime, had not fled. This was something that several people had expected, and that Cale had specifically predicted would not happen. He had said, "Cord is not the kind of person who runs. He is the kind of person who, when cornered, attempts to restructure the terms of the situation. He stays and he negotiates, and he tries to find the version of events that leaves him with something." Cord had attempted to reach 3 different senior pack members in the 24 hours after the panel's finding. All 3 had declined to respond. He had also placed a call to Neil, his legal representative, which had lasted 45 minutes, and during which Neil had apparently been quite direct with him about the landscape of his options. The landscape, as described by several people who spoke to Neil afterward, was not hospitable. The governance referral in the panel's finding was binding. The specific charge, intentional manipulation of official documents in a formal PAC proceeding, carried mandatory minimum consequences under the revised PAC law framework, up to and including permanent removal of rank and territorial exile. Cord's 17 years of careful positioning, of making himself essential and indispensable, did not insulate him from the finding. If anything, it complicated his situation, because the evidence of his positioning that had accumulated over the same period would be relevant to any review of the original charge. Cale had built the file with this in mind. He was thorough. What Cord had, and what he was now attempting to negotiate with, was the question of whether his departure from Ashwood would be managed or contested. A managed departure, in which he left without a prolonged legal battle, might allow him to preserve some small portion of his dignity, and to exit on terms that were explicitly agreed, rather than simply imposed. A contested departure would involve a full investigation of his 17 years in the beta role, which would expose considerably more than the document fraud. He chose managed. The negotiations took 2 days and were handled between Francis and Neil without either Cale or Cord present. Francis gave Cale a summary afterward. The terms were not generous, but they were real. Cord would formally resign his position, submit a statement acknowledging the evidence, and leave the territory within 10 days. In exchange, the governance referral would be resolved through the resignation, rather than through a full investigation, which meant the specific contents of the broader investigation would not become part of the public record. Cale had agreed to this. He had explained his reasoning to Riven, who had listened and then said, "You're letting him walk." Cale said, "I'm letting him walk without more of what he wants. He wants to make this complicated. He wants to drag it out and make it messy and create enough noise that something gets obscured or the process gets derailed. Not letting him do that is worth the trade." Riven had thought about this. He said, "As long as he's actually gone." Cale said, "He'll be gone." He was. On the 8th day, after the panel's finding, Cord left Ashwood territory. He did not make an announcement. He did not say goodbye to anyone who was not obliged to process his paperwork. He loaded his belongings into 2 vehicles over the course of an afternoon, and drove out through the main gates in the early evening, without looking back. George, the young wolf who had walked Elena to the boundary 17 years earlier, was on gate duty that evening. He watched Cord's vehicles pass through. He thought about the woman he had escorted to the boundary in the dark, in the cold, with a bag and $40, and a jacket that was not warm enough, and who he had been too young and too uncertain to say anything to. He had thought about that walk many times in the years since. He had thought about whether there was something he could have done or said, whether his silence had been cowardice, or simply the paralysis of someone who did not yet understand what he was participating in. He watched the gates close behind Cord. He thought, not everything comes back around, but some things do. He went back to his post. Inside the PAC, in Barb's kitchen and Grace's sitting room and the training yard and the administrative offices, the work of the transition had begun. It was not simple work. It was not work that could be done in a few days or weeks, but it was work, real and forward-facing work, and the people doing it had the particular energy of a community that has been waiting for something to release and has now felt the release begin. Cale and Riven were not yet in the territory. They were still outside, still planning, still giving the PAC the space to absorb what had happened before they arrived to begin the next stage. But they were close, and everyone in the PAC knew it. The thing about 17 years is that it is a very long time, long enough for a lie to become furniture, long enough for people to stop questioning the shape of the room they are living in. But the thing about furniture is that when you finally move it, you see what was always there beneath it. The truth had always been there. It had simply needed someone with the patience and the purpose and the particular kind of love that does not become smaller under pressure to find it, build a case around it, and bring it into the light. That someone was a woman, in a city some distance away, who had walked out of a PAC boundary in the dark, with $40 and 2 children she had not yet told anyone about, and 2 young men who had learned from her that the truth, properly built and properly timed, was the most powerful thing in any room. The meeting room that Darian chose was small. This was telling. He had access to every room in the pack facility, including the large formal chambers where pack governance had been conducted for 3 generations. He could have chosen the Alpha's meeting room, with its long table and high windows, and the weight of institutional authority it carried. He could have chosen a neutral space in the administrative wing. He chose, instead, a room that most pack members used for informal conversations, a room with a round table and 4 plain chairs, and a window that looked out at the inner courtyard where the pack's old trees grew. Cale noticed the choice before he sat down. He noticed it and placed it in the context of everything else he had been observing since they arrived at the pack grounds for the first time that morning. He had been observing constantly, not with the conspicuous attention of someone doing surveillance, but with the quiet, uninterrupted attentiveness he had always carried. The pack grounds were larger than he had imagined from his research, and older. The buildings had the particular solidity of structures that had been maintained with genuine care, rather than simply maintained. The people they had passed in the corridors had looked at them with expressions that varied: curiosity in the younger wolves, a more complex recognition in the older ones, and in at least 2 faces he identified as significant from Grace's briefings, something that was unmistakably relief. Riven had walked beside him without looking at anyone specifically, which was its own kind of observation. Riven absorbed environments differently, not through deliberate cataloging but through a kind of physical comprehension, the same awareness that made him exceptional in physical confrontation, and that applied equally to any space he was moving through. He would report his observations later, and they would be different from Cale's, and together, they would have a more complete picture than either could have assembled alone. They sat down. Darian came in 3 minutes later. He was older than the photographs Elena had kept, which were photographs from 17 years ago. He was 61, and the silver that Elena had used to touch at his temples had spread, and was now most of his hair. He moved with the slight stiffness of someone whose body had accumulated the normal costs of decades of physical leadership, but he was still large, still broad across the shoulders, still present in a room, in the way that people who have led for a long time are present. He stopped when he saw them. It was only a moment, half a second, perhaps less, but Cale saw it clearly. The halt, the intake of breath, the work Darian's face did in that half second, absorbing something it had been told was true, but had not yet had to confront visually. Then he came to the table, and he sat down. He looked at them. He looked at them, the way that people look at things they have been thinking about for a very long time, that have now become real in front of them. He looked at Cale's face, and then at Riven's face, and then back at Cale, and the thing happening in his expression was very complicated, and Cale let it happen without speaking. Riven also said nothing. He sat with his arms on the table and his hands folded, and he watched Darian with the attentiveness that was his particular quality. The kind of watching that is not hostile and not warm but is entirely present. Darian said, "You look like her." He said it to both of them, addressing the space between them. His voice was controlled. He had been controlling his voice under difficult circumstances for a long time. Cale said, "We know." A pause. Darian said, "Harold told me. He said you were, that you are." He stopped. He started again. "I've been trying to find the right way to begin this conversation for 3 days, and I don't think there is one." Cale said, "There isn't, so we don't need to find one. We can begin somewhere practical." Darian looked at him. There was something in his expression at that moment that Cale would think about for a long time afterward. Not quite surprise, not quite recognition, but something between them. The look of a man who is seeing something he expected from a distance, and that is, up close. Both exactly what he thought it would be, and also different in ways he had not anticipated. He said, "All right, somewhere practical." Cale said, "Do you have questions about the evidence?" Darian said, "No." He said it without hesitation. "I read the panel's finding. I read the full documentation. I spoke to Grace." He looked at the table. "I have had 17 years to wonder whether I was wrong, and I have been choosing not to look at it directly for most of those 17 years. The evidence confirms what I already knew, but had decided not to face." Riven said, from his side of the table, "Why?" Not why did you believe it, not why did you exile her, just why. The specific why that came from someone who had been given 17 years worth of a question and was asking it directly, without preamble, without softening. Darian was quiet. He said, "Because I had been afraid of being wrong before, in other decisions, and had been right. And because Cord was someone I trusted absolutely, and who had given me no reason not to trust him. And because—" He stopped. He looked at the window. "Because she was everything I had in the world, and the possibility that she could do something that would hurt the pack was the most frightening thing I had ever considered, and fear is not a good advisor." He said this last thing flatly, as a fact about himself, rather than an excuse. Cale waited a moment, then he said, "Did you look for her? After? When you had time to think?" Darian looked at him. "No," he said. It was a very small word, for a very large answer. Cale listened to everything in it. Darian said, "There were moments when I thought about it, when the doubt was too loud to ignore. When I looked at Cord, and wondered why I had believed him so quickly, and what I had actually verified, and what I had only been told." He paused. "But I had severed the bond. What I had done could not be undone. And I know this is not sufficient, but I think I made myself believe that looking for her would be unfair to her, that I had no right to find her after what I had done." Riven said, "You had no right not to." It landed with a quietness that was more effective than any raised voice could have been. Darian said nothing for a moment. He nodded. Once. He did not look away from Riven. He received the statement with the stillness of someone who is not arguing with it because they know it is entirely true. He said, "I know." The room was quiet. Cale let the quiet hold for a moment. He had planned a great deal of this conversation in advance, but planning a conversation and having it are different things, and he had always known that the conversation would need to be allowed to find its own shape at certain points. This was one of those points. He gave it the space it needed. Then he said, "We are not here for an apology." Darian looked at him. Cale said, "We are here because there are practical decisions to make about the pack's leadership and transition, and because those decisions involve you and your role, and because we believe you deserve to be spoken to directly, rather than simply informed of an outcome." He paused. "We could have done this entirely without you. The finding stands, regardless of this conversation. What happens to the pack next can be organized without your input. We are choosing to have this conversation because we think it is the right thing to do, not because we need something from you." Darian said, "What do you want me to do?" Cale said, "We want to tell you what we are going to do, and then we want your honest assessment of whether there are things we have not accounted for, because you know this pack in ways that we have only been able to approximate from the outside." Darian looked at him for a long moment. He said, "All right." Cale talked for 20 minutes. He laid out the transition plan with the same precision he brought to everything: the co-regency structure, the council oversight framework, the specific reforms they intended to implement regarding the formal rights of pack members in evidence proceedings. He talked about the people they had already spoken to, and the areas of the pack structure they were still learning. He talked about what they needed and what they intended to build. Darian listened without interrupting. He made no expression that gave away what he was thinking. He was listening the way Cale recognized, gathering, processing, building his own assessment. When Cale finished, Darian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's a problem with the Eastern Territorial Agreement that you need to know about. Cord managed that relationship personally for 8 years, and the terms of the current agreement are verbal rather than written, which means with him gone, the relationship will need to be rebuilt from scratch." He said it directly, as a practical piece of information, without any of the emotion that had shaped the beginning of the conversation. "The wolf you need to speak to is a woman named Helen, who is the senior contact on the other side. She is fair, and she is relationship-driven, which means the meeting matters as much as what you say in it." Cale made a note. Darian said, "The training structure that Cord dismantled about 6 years ago was strong. It built loyalty and community in the pack. Rebuilding it would help with the cohesion of the younger generation. The wolf who designed the original program is still in the pack. His name is Derek." Cale looked up from his notebook. He said, "Riven knows Derek." Darian looked at Riven. Something in his face shifted almost imperceptibly. "Of course he does," he said, very quietly. Not to anyone specifically. To the room. To the years. For the next hour, Darian went through the pack with them. Not from the position of someone protecting his legacy, but from the position of someone who knew the place intimately, and who had nothing left to protect, and could therefore simply tell the truth. He identified the pressure points. He identified the relationships that had held and the ones that had eroded. He told them about the elders who were sharp and the ones who had become complacent. He told them about the pack members who had been quietly waiting for something to change and who would be the most valuable allies in the transition. He told them everything. When he was done, Cale closed his notebook. He looked at Darian. He said, "Thank you. This is useful." Darian said, "It's the least I can do." Neither of them disputed this. There was a pause. Riven had been quiet for most of the latter part of the conversation, letting Cale lead, which was the natural way of their dynamic when the work was organizational. But now he looked at Darian directly. He said, "Our mother won't be coming to pack territory right away. When she does come, it will be on her terms and her timeline, not ours and not yours." Darian said, "I understand." Riven said, "I'm telling you this so you know it's not something to negotiate." Darian said, "I'm not going to negotiate it." Riven looked at him steadily for a moment. He was not threatening. He was simply being clear, making sure that the message arrived with its full meaning. He said, "Good." They stood to leave. Darian also stood. He looked at them both. His hands were at his sides, exactly the way they had been in Elena's description of that night in the hall 17 years ago, hanging there like things that had forgotten what they were for. But the expression on his face was different. It was not the expression of a man who had made up his mind to do something terrible. It was the expression of a man who was standing in the full weight of what his life had been, and was looking at two people who were the consequence of his worst choice and his best love simultaneously, and who had no idea what to do with that, except to be there in it honestly. Cale and Riven walked out. In the hallway, Riven said nothing. Cale said nothing. They walked to the main entrance together and went outside into the afternoon. Riven said, "He told the truth. Mean there." Cale said, "I know." Riven said, "That doesn't change what he did." Cale said, "No, but it changes what we can do with what comes next." Riven thought about this as they walked toward the car. He said, "You're right." He did not say it easily. He said it with the careful deliberateness of someone who has arrived at something through real effort rather than finding it handed to them. But he said it. Cale said, "I know." They drove back to the place they were staying, a rented house on the outer edge of the nearest town, chosen for its distance from the pack grounds and its lack of significant foot traffic. They had been there for 4 days, long enough for the house to feel like a workspace, rather than simply a temporary lodging, with Cale's documents spread across the dining table, and Riven's running shoes at the door, and the particular ordered disorder of two people who work well together in close quarters. Elena called that evening. She always called in the evening. It had been her habit since they were young, checking in at the end of the day in a way that was not hovering. She was constitutionally incapable of hovering. It was not part of how she functioned, but was simply the practice of someone who believed in staying connected to the people she loved even across distance. Cale answered. He gave her a precise account of the meeting, in the order it had happened, with the relevant details and without editorializing. He told her what Darian had said, and what Darian had told them about the pack. He told her about the Eastern Territorial Agreement, and about Derek. He told her about the moment with Riven's name. Elena was quiet on the other end. Then she said, "And how was he?" Cale thought about how to answer this. He said, "He was honest. More honest than I expected, I think. He didn't try to make himself look better than he is." Elena said, "No, he never did. That was always one of the things about him." She paused. It was also one of the things that made it so difficult. He knew what he was. He just made the wrong choice with that knowledge. Cale said, "Yes." She said, "How is Riven?" Cale looked at his brother, who was in the kitchen, making something with a focused expression. He said, "Processing." She said, "Give him time." Cale said, "I will." She said goodnight, and the call ended, and Cale sat for a moment with the phone in his hand, before putting it down and going back to his notes. Riven came in from the kitchen with 2 bowls of something and set one in front of Cale without comment. He sat down across the table. They ate in silence for a while. Riven said, "I've been thinking about what he said, about not looking for her." Cale said, "And?" Riven said, "I understand why he didn't. I don't agree with it. But I understand the specific fear that creates that particular kind of paralysis. You do something bad enough, and you tell yourself that staying away is mercy. Because what is mercy actually? At that point, accept the choice that you can live with. Kale said, You think that's what it was? Riven said, I think that's what it looked like from the inside. Whether it actually was is a different question. He looked at his food. He believed the thing Cord told him. And then he spent 17 years building his life on top of not fully looking at whether he was right. That's not evil, it's just human. Weak in the specific way that intelligent, capable people are weak when they are afraid. Kale said, Mum knew. Riven said, Mum always knew what she was dealing with. That's why she didn't spend 17 years hating him. She spent 17 years building something instead. Kale was quiet for a moment. He said, You have complicated feelings about him. Riven said, Yes. He said it without any particular drama, and that's fine. You can have complicated feelings about someone and still know exactly what the situation requires. They're not the same thing. Kale said, No, they're not. They finished eating. Kale went back to his notes. Riven went out for a walk, which was how he ended difficult evenings, moving through whatever was in him, with the particular intelligence of someone whose body had always been a part of his thinking. He walked for an hour through the border town's quiet streets. The evening was cool, the sky beginning to show the particular density of a night with many stars, and he walked at a steady pace with his hands in his pockets, and his thoughts doing what they did, not forcing, not resisting, just moving through the material that the day had provided. He thought about Darian's hands at his sides. He thought about the small room. He thought about the choice of the small room, and what it said about the man who had chosen it. He thought about his mother's voice on the phone, the particular quality of her voice when she asked how Darian was, not hurt and not forgiving, simply the voice of someone who had integrated a difficult thing fully enough that she could ask about it without it controlling her. He thought about who he was in relation to all of this. He was Riven Ashwood, but Ashwood was not a name he had ever used, and was not yet a name he had fully claimed. He was also Elena's son, which was a name he had worn his whole life, and that fit him completely. He was both things, and the work of the next period was going to be about learning how to hold both things without losing either. He was 17 years old. He had the rest of his life to figure it out. He came back to the rented house. Kale was still at the table, writing. The light above him was the only light on in the room. Riven came in, took off his shoes, looked at his brother. He said, We're going to be all right. Kale looked up. He said, I know. Riven sat down. They worked for another 2 hours, in the particular companionable silence of two people who have always worked well in the same room, before the night became late enough to make sleep the right choice. Tomorrow there was more to do. Tomorrow there was always more to do. But tonight, in the quiet of the rented house with the notes spread across the table and the stars doing whatever stars do outside the window, they were all right. And that was exactly what it needed to be. Elena chose a Tuesday. She had given it a great deal of thought, not the date specifically, but the quality of it. She did not want ceremony. She did not want the pack to organize anything in advance that would turn her arrival into an event, because what an event requires of everyone present is performance, and she did not want anyone performing, not them and not herself. She wanted to arrive, and she wanted it to be real, and real things are almost never performed. She called Grace on the Sunday evening. She said she was coming on Tuesday morning. She said she would like Grace to be there when she arrived, and she said that she did not need anyone else specifically, though if people were present she would deal with that. She said she was not looking for a reception. She said she was not looking for an apology, or a speech, or anything formal. She said she simply needed to walk through those gates, and she needed to do it on her feet and in her own time. Grace said, I'll be at the gate at 9. Elena said, 9 is fine. She slept reasonably well on the Monday night, which surprised her. She had expected the night before to be difficult, long and wakeful with the accumulated weight of 17 years pressing at her from all sides. Instead, she slept for 6 hours, and woke before the alarm, with a clarity that was almost physical, the clarity of someone whose body has made its peace with what is coming, even before the mind has fully finished with it. She drove herself. Kale had offered to drive. She had said no. Riven had offered to come with her. She had said she loved him, and she would see him there. They had both accepted this, because they knew her, and because they understood, that the way she needed to do this was alone, arriving under her own power, without anyone managing the situation for her. They had spent 17 years making sure she had everything she needed. What she needed now was to do this herself. The drive was 3 hours. She left at 6 in the morning. The roads were quiet in the early light, and she drove steadily without hurrying, listening to the radio for the first hour, and then turning it off, and letting the silence do its work. She thought about a lot of things during those 3 hours. She thought about her mother, who had died when the boys were 4, and who had never known what her daughter had survived or what she had built. She thought about Owen Marsh, who had answered a phone call in the middle of the night from a stranger and had opened a door. She thought about Arthur and the apartment above the hardware store and the small metal box under the bed. She thought about Carol, who had been calm and competent through the longest night of Elena's life and had brought her tea after and held her hand for a minute without saying anything, and then quietly packed her things and let Elena be with her sons. She thought about all the people who had made her survival possible and who had never been part of the official record of any of this and never would be. The unofficial people who keep the world moving, who do the small and crucial things that do not get written down. She felt a gratitude for them that was so large it could not quite fit inside her chest. She thought about Cale and Riven. She thought about them the way she had always thought about them, which was constantly, and with the particular attention of someone who has been watching two remarkable things develop from the very beginning, and who is still, even now, consistently surprised by them. They had become people she would have admired, even if she had not made them. That was the strange truth about her sons. They were hers, entirely, and they were also entirely their own, and the combination of those two things was the most extraordinary thing she had ever been part of. She thought about the pack. She thought about the people there who had known her, and who had stayed quiet for 17 years, not because they were cowards, most of them were not, but because they had been trapped inside a structure that punished honesty and rewarded silence, the same trap that traps most people in most institutions when the power is badly distributed. She did not blame them. She had thought about blaming them at various points over the years, and had always arrived at the same conclusion. Blame is not useful when the person you are thinking about blaming was also in a difficult position, and also doing their best, and also failed. It is useful to understand what happened, and to build structures that make it less likely to happen again. It is not useful to convert that understanding into a personal verdict about people who are going to be needed in what comes next. What comes next needed everyone. She crossed into the territory 30 minutes before 9. She recognized the landscape. It was older, the trees bigger, the roads somewhat different in their surface quality, but the bones of it were the same. She had driven these roads hundreds of times, in a different life, and her body remembered them in the particular way that bodies remember things that happen through repeated experience, not through thought, but through a kind of orientation, a sense of where things were before she saw them. She pulled up at the gate at 8:53. Grace was already there. She was standing just outside the gate, because she was thoughtful enough to understand that being inside the gate would put Elena in the position of arriving to something, whereas being outside it meant they could walk in together. She had a coat on against the morning chill, and her white hair was pinned up in the way Elena remembered, and she was holding a paper cup of tea that she extended to Elena as she got out of the car. Elena looked at her. Grace looked back. Grace said, "You look exactly the same." Elena laughed. The sound surprised her. A real laugh, full and genuine. She said, "You're being very kind." Grace said, "I'm being accurate. I was there when you were 26 years old, and I am looking at you now, and the main difference is that you look like someone who has done a great deal of living." Elena took the tea. It was warm in her hands. She looked at the gate. It was the same gate. She recognized the iron, the shape of the posts, the particular latch mechanism. She had passed through it hundreds of times. The last time she had passed through it, she had been going outward, in the dark, with an escort who could not look at her. She stood at it for a moment. Not to compose herself, she was composed. To be present in the specific reality of standing here. To let the moment be what it was, rather than moving through it so quickly that she arrived on the other side, without having fully experienced it. She had earned this moment. Not earned in the sense of deserved, which was a different kind of thing, but earned in the sense of worked for, built toward, made possible through 17 years of daily decisions that had brought her here. She reached out and opened the gate herself. Grace walked through beside her. The pack grounds opened up ahead. She did not know who had told people she was coming. Grace had promised discretion, and she trusted Grace's definition of discretion, which was why she was not entirely surprised, and also not prepared for the number of people who had found reasons to be in the courtyard and the paths near the main entrance on a Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. They were not staged, they were not organized, they were simply there, in the way that people are there when news travels through a community, that something significant is happening in a place they are connected to. Some of them were people she recognized, older wolves whose faces she knew completely, who looked at her with the expression of people seeing something they had given up expecting to see. Some of them were people she did not know at all, younger wolves who had grown up after her exile, and for whom she was only a story until this moment. Nobody spoke at first. Barb was there. Elena recognized her immediately. Barb had always been physically distinctive, tall, with a posture so upright it was almost aggressive, and she had aged in the way of people who age well, which is to say visibly, but with an increase in dignity, rather than a loss of it. She was standing near the center of the courtyard with her arms at her sides, and an expression that Elena could not fully read from a distance. As Elena and Grace walked through the gate and along the path, Barb stepped forward. She said, "Elena." Just the name, nothing attached to it, nothing qualifying it. Elena looked at her. Barb said, "I'm glad you're back." The words were simple. They were the right words because they were real. Not an apology, not an explanation, not a speech. Just an honest statement of a thing that was true. Elena said, "Thank you, Barb." They looked at each other for a moment longer. Then Barb stepped back, and Elena and Grace continued. The walk through the grounds took 20 minutes. Not because the distance required it, but because people kept approaching, quietly, one or two at a time, to say something, or simply to be acknowledged. Elena responded to each of them with the same quality of attention she had always had, the attention that had always made people feel seen, the thing Cale had inherited in his way, and Riven in his. She was not performing this, it was simply how she was. An old wolf named Martin, who had been in his 50s when she was Luna, and who was now in his 70s, and walked with a cane, stopped her in the path and looked at her and said, "You were the best Luna this pack ever had." He said it with the directness of a man who had decided there was no point in saying things with any less than their full weight. She said, "You're very kind to say so." He said, "I'm saying so because it's true, and I should have said it a long time ago. I'm saying it now." She put her hand on his arm for a moment. He covered her hand with his. Then she continued. Cale and Riven were waiting at the east wing, the building with the library she had created 17 years ago, the small library that she had built from what had previously been a storage room. She had not asked them to meet her there specifically, but she was not surprised that Cale had chosen it. He had a particular instinct for the right gesture. They were standing outside the door when she came around the corner. She looked at them. These two people, her sons, 17 years old, standing at the door of something she had built in a life that had been taken from her and that was being returned to her now in a different form. She had thought she might cry at some point during this morning. She had given herself permission to, in the internal way she gave herself permission to things, noting that it would be entirely reasonable and that she should not resist it if it came. It did not come. What came instead was something quieter and more total, a sense of having arrived. Not arrived in the sense of having finished. Nothing was finished. There was an enormous amount of work ahead, more work than any of them could yet fully see, but arrived in the sense of having reached the place where the work could begin. She stood between her sons. She put one hand on Cale's arm, and one hand on Riven's. She looked at the library door. She said, "Did they keep it up?" Cale said, "It's actually bigger. They expanded it about 4 years ago." She nodded. She said, "Good." They stood there together for a moment, the three of them, in the morning light of a Tuesday, in a place that was both familiar and entirely new, in the way that places are when you have been changed by the time you were away from them. Then Elena said, "All right, let's go see what needs doing." And they went inside. Inside the library, she stood very still. It was larger, as Cale had said. The original room had been extended through a wall that had previously been solid, opening into what had been a small office, and the shelves that she had built and organized and stocked now continued into that additional space. The original shelves were still the same, The wood she had chosen, the arrangement she had set up, the small handwritten labels on each section that someone had carefully maintained, and in some cases updated over the years. She walked along the shelves. Her fingers moved along the spines of the books without her really thinking about it, the way you touch things that were once yours and that your hands remember. There was a new section. At the far end of the expanded space, a cluster of shelves held a specific collection with a handwritten label at the front. The handwriting was not hers. She leaned forward to read the label. It said, "History of Ashwood." She looked at the books behind the label. They were a mix of formal pack records and more informal materials. Journals, personal accounts, photographs in protective sleeves. She reached out and touched the spine of the nearest one. Riven said, from behind her, "Barb organized that section about 3 years ago. She said the pack needed to know where it had come from." Elena looked at the section for a moment longer. She said, "Smart woman." Riven said, "Very." They stayed in the library for an hour, the three of them, not because there was a specific purpose to staying there, but because the time was right. Cale sat at one of the tables and went through his notes, integrating the observations from the morning walk through the grounds. Riven stood near the windows. Elena moved through the shelves, pulling books occasionally, reading a few pages, replacing them. It was one of the most ordinary hours she could remember in a long time. Quiet, warm, purposeful without any particular urgency. The kind of hour that is easy to undervalue when it is happening, and that you find yourself grateful for in retrospect. When they left the library, the formal portion of the day began. Elena had agreed, through Cale, to attend a meeting with Harold and the other senior elders who remained. Not the formal kind of meeting with a set agenda and official proceedings. They had had enough of those. Simply a meeting of people who needed to be in the same room together, and who had things to say to one another that would be better said now than deferred. There were 6 elders present, including Grace. Harold opened by apologizing. He was direct and brief, and he did not reach for language that softened what he was saying. He said that the pack had failed her, that the elder body had failed her specifically, and that this was true regardless of the circumstances that had made it easier to stay silent. He said he was sorry, and that he understood an apology did not change what had happened. Elena listened to this. She said, "Thank you for saying it directly." She did not say she forgave him, because forgiveness was something she had not been asked to perform, and would not be performing on any particular timeline for anyone else's comfort. She said she understood that it had been complicated, and she said that what mattered now was what they built from here, and she said she was willing to be part of building it. Harold nodded. The conversation that followed was practical. They talked about the transition period, about the things that needed to happen in the near term, and the things that could wait. They talked about which wolves in the pack needed particular attention, those who had been deeply connected to Cord, and who would need time and structure to rebuild their loyalty to the pack, as an institution, rather than to a person. They talked about the things Darian had identified in his conversation with the boys. They talked about Helen, the Eastern Territory contact, and about Derek and the training program. Elena contributed to this conversation actively. She had been outside the pack for 17 years, but she had never stopped thinking about it, and the thinking she had done, from the position of an outsider who had once been an insider, had given her a perspective on the pack's weaknesses and strengths that was different from anyone else in the room. She could see it freshly. She could see what had calcified and what had held, and she knew from years of observing other communities what the patterns meant. Grace watched her contribute to the conversation with an expression that Elena could not quite read from across the table, until she caught Grace's eye directly, and Grace gave her the specific small nod of a woman who is watching something turn out the way she had hoped, and is taking quiet satisfaction in it. Elena thought, "I am going to like having her nearby." The meeting ended at midday. Elena ate lunch with Cale and Riven and Grace at a small table in the kitchen of the administrative building, the ordinary kitchen where pack members made tea and ate sandwiches, and had the kinds of conversations that never made it into any formal record. The kitchen was clean and warm and smelled of coffee. Someone had left a plant on the windowsill that had been there long enough to grow large and spreading, and that nobody had apparently been inclined to move. Riven looked at the plant and said, "That needs water." Grace said, "It always looks like that. It's been fine for 6 years." Riven said, "It's very unhappy." Grace said, "It's extremely resilient." Elena watched this exchange and felt, unexpectedly, a laugh building in her chest. She let it come. It arrived with a warmth that she had not anticipated, and that surprised her completely with its completeness. She laughed at the plant, in the kitchen, with her sons and her ally, in the building that had once been her home, and was now becoming something else, something she did not yet have a full name for but that felt, in this specific moment, entirely right. The afternoon was busy. There were more meetings, more conversations, more people who needed to be spoken to, or listened to, or simply acknowledged. Elena moved through all of it steadily, and without visible tiredness, though by 4 in the afternoon, the tiredness was there under the steadiness, a bone-deep kind, that came not from the day being difficult, but from the day being full, in a way that exceeded ordinary days. At 5 o'clock she went back outside. She walked through the grounds by herself, slowly, without any particular destination. She went to the garden she had planted in the east wing in her first spring there. It was fully overgrown now, not neglectfully but naturally, in the way that things grow when left to do what they want, rather than kept in a shape. There were plants there she had put in, and plants she had not, because over the years, the garden had developed on its own terms, which she found oddly satisfying. She sat on the bench at the garden's edge. She sat for a while. She thought about the Tuesday 17 years ago, when she had walked out of this place with $40 and a jacket that was not warm enough. She thought about the bench outside the closed convenience store where she had sat in the cold and decided to be methodical. She thought about Owen, and Arthur, and Carol, and all the years in between. She thought, I have been a long time getting back here. And then she thought, but I got here, and I got here right. The evening light came in through the old trees and lay in long patterns across the garden. She stayed until the light changed. Then she got up, straightened her jacket, and went to find her sons. There was still so much to do, but she was here. And that, after 17 years, was everything. The pack council met on a Friday. The timing had been Cale's. He had thought carefully about when in the transition process the formal leadership council should convene, and had concluded that it needed to happen after Elena's return, but before the work of restructuring had become too entrenched without formal authority behind it. Too soon, and the council would be managing shock rather than building. Too late, and things would have moved into informal patterns that would be harder to formalize properly. Friday, 8 days after Elena's return, was right. Harold called the meeting in his capacity as senior elder. Every voting member of the pack council was required to attend, and every one of them did, not only because attendance was mandatory, but because this was a meeting that people wanted to be present for. Even the wolves who had been closest to Cord over the years, and who had the most complicated feelings about the current state of affairs were there, because whatever they felt about the transition, they were not fools, and fools were the only people who would miss this. Darian was there. He had been invited, not as a participant with voting authority, but as the current alpha, under whose formal authority the transition was occurring. He could not be excluded from this meeting by any provision of pack law, and he had not been asked to be excluded. He sat at the table in a position that was neither at the head, which Harold occupied, nor at the periphery, but at one side in the way of someone who is present and engaged but is not the focus. He had been like this in the 8 days since Elena's return. Present, not absent, not invisible, not hiding from what was happening, but clearly and purposefully not in the center of it, not occupying space that he understood was no longer his to occupy. Grace had observed this to Cale with a quiet approval. She had said that she had not been certain what to expect from Darian in this period, whether he would try to shape the narrative or resist the transition in small ways, and that his behavior had been better than she had expected. Cale had noted this and filed it. Cale opened the substantive portion of the meeting. He had discussed with Harold who should speak first, and Harold had said simply, "You." He had said that the council needed to hear from Cale first, because Cale was the one who understood the full shape of what he was proposing, and that anything else was putting the arrangement before the reasoning, and the reasoning needed to come first. Cale stood. He looked at the people around the table. He had spent days learning their histories, their roles, their relationships to the pack and to each other, and he looked at them now with the kind of attention that comes from genuine preparation, rather than from trying to read the room in the moment. He knew this room. He had studied it. He spoke for 30 minutes without notes. He laid out the co-regency proposal in full. 2 co-alphas, operating with distinct and complementary responsibilities, rather than as an undifferentiated pair. Kale would lead administrative functions, governance, legal matters, interpack relations, and the structural reforms they intended to implement. Riven would lead operations, territorial, training, community well-being, and the daily functions of pack life. Council oversight would be genuine rather than ceremonial, with specific powers to review and challenge decisions by either co-alpha on defined criteria. The council would include rotating seats occupied by pack members, selected through a transparent process, rather than appointed by leadership. He described each element precisely and explained the reasoning behind each choice, including the ways in which each choice had been designed specifically to prevent the kind of structural failure that had allowed Cord to operate unchallenged for 17 years. He did not mention Cord by name in this portion of his presentation. He did not need to. Every person in the room understood the reference. He concluded by saying that none of this required them to accept any of it without question. He said he was presenting it as a proposal, genuinely, not as a conclusion that had already been made and was being dressed up as a consultation. He said he and Riven would remain in the room for as long as was needed to discuss any aspect of the proposal, and that any objections or modifications that came from this council, and that were well-reasoned, would be considered genuinely. He sat down. The council talked for 2 hours. It was a real conversation. Not every member was unconditionally enthusiastic. 2 of the older wolves had significant questions about the operational separation. They were worried that 2 co-alphas with distinct domains would inevitably produce conflicts of authority that would be more destabilizing than a single unified leadership. Kale answered these questions directly and in detail, describing the specific conflict resolution mechanism built into the proposal, and the historical cases he had researched in which dual leadership structures had succeeded, and those in which they had failed, and the differences between the cases. A younger wolf named Pete, who had grown up under Cord's influence and who Kale had noted as someone who would need time, asked a blunt question: whether the proposal had been designed to avoid giving anyone a strong enough position to accumulate the kind of power Cord had accumulated, and whether this meant the leadership would be inherently weaker as a result. Kale said yes to the first part. He said that was exactly the intent. He said that a leadership structure that was strong enough to produce someone like Cord was not actually strong. It was concentrated in a way that created enormous vulnerability, and that what they were building was not weaker but more distributed, which was a different kind of strength. Pete listened to this. He did not say he was convinced, but he asked 2 follow-up questions that were genuine rather than adversarial, and Kale answered them the same way. Riven, throughout the council meeting, said relatively little. He spoke when a question was specifically about the operational side of the proposal, and when his answer would add something Kale had not already covered. He watched the room with his particular quality of attention, and he observed the dynamics. Who was persuadable, who had already decided, who was uncertain in ways that were productive, and who was uncertain in ways that were defensive. He stored this information for later use. At one point, Barb looked at him across the table and said, "You've been quiet." Riven said, "Kale said everything I would have said better than I would have said it. There's no point in saying it twice." A small but genuine laugh moved around the table. Harold called for a vote at the end of the second hour. The vote was not unanimous. Pete voted to abstain, which was his right, and which Kale had anticipated as a realistic outcome. 2 of the older wolves voted in favor with formal reservations on record, which was also anticipated. The remaining members voted in favor without qualification. The co-regency was approved. Darian, who did not have a vote in this proceeding, said nothing during the vote itself. Afterward, when Harold closed the formal session and people began to move around the room in the way of a meeting that has ended but whose participants are not yet ready to leave, Darian stood and walked to where Kale was standing. He said, "The council conflict mechanism. You borrowed the basic framework from the Western pack structure, yes? The one they implemented about 12 years ago." Kale looked at him. He said, "Yes, with modifications." Darian said, "The modification to the timeline, the 48-hour dispute window rather than 72, was a good change. The original implementation had problems at 72 hours. People let things fester. 48 forces resolution faster." Kale said, "That was one of the reasons." Darian nodded. He started to move away. Then he stopped. He said without turning back, "You did this well, both of you." He continued walking. Kale stood and watched him go. He thought about the man who had chosen a small room with a round table for a conversation he had not had to make easy. He thought about the 20 minutes when Darian had spoken about the pack with nothing to protect and everything to simply tell. He thought about the handover of information about Helen and Derek, offered freely and without being asked, by a man who was handing over a thing he had built and was doing it properly rather than just walking away from it. He was not going to revise his understanding of what Darian had done. He was not going to smooth over it or find language that made it smaller than it was. Darian had believed a lie and had exiled his pregnant mate and had failed to look for her when he knew something was wrong and had built a life on the foundation of not fully facing that. These were real things and they had real consequences, and they were not going to become smaller because Darian was being decent now. But decent now was something. It was not nothing. Riven came to stand beside him. He had been watching the same thing. Darian's path across the room, the quality of his movement, the specific shape of a man choosing how to be in a situation he could not change. Riven said, very quietly, "He's trying." Kale said, "Yes." Riven said, "I'm still working on how I feel about that." Kale said, "Take your time." Riven said, "I know." The reception that followed the council meeting was not formal. It was the kind of gathering that happens naturally after something significant, when people need to be in each other's company, and to talk, and to eat, and to process together, in the way that communities process large events, by being around other people who were also there, and also felt the weight of it. Food appeared from the kitchen, voices filled the room. The younger wolves who had been quiet during the formal portion of the meeting seemed to exhale collectively and become themselves again. Elena was there. She moved through the room the way she had always moved through it, with genuine interest in the people she was talking to, asking questions rather than holding court, remembering the things people told her with the attentiveness that had always made people feel genuinely important to her. She talked to Pete for 10 minutes at one point, the young wolf who had abstained, and whatever they talked about made his expression shift from guarded to thoughtful. And when the conversation ended, he came to find Kale and said he had a question about the conflict resolution mechanism that he had not asked in the meeting, but that he would like to discuss when there was time. Kale said there was time now if he wanted. They found a corner and talked for 20 minutes. When Pete left, he had not said he was going to formally change his vote, or that he was now without reservations. He had said he understood the structure better, and that he would be watching how it worked in practice. He said it with the directness of someone being honest, rather than diplomatic. Kale respected it. The evening stretched long, the kind of long that happens when people are not ready to leave. When the pack grounds outside were dark, and the room was warm, and something important had happened that everyone needed a little more time inside of before going back to the ordinary world. Kale found his mother near the window at one point. She was looking out at the dark courtyard with a mug in her hands. He stood beside her. She said, without turning, "How do you feel?" He thought about it. He said, "Like we've been running up a very long hill, and we've reached the top, and the view is very large." She said, "Yes." He said, "And now we have to decide what to do with the view." She said, "You already know what to do with it." He said, "I know." She said, "Stop being philosophical about it, and go and have something to eat. You haven't eaten since this morning." He laughed. He went and ate. Later, when the evening had fully moved into night, and the gathering had thinned to the core group of people who were either too comfortable or too content to leave, Grace, Barb, Harold, a few others, Kale and Riven and Elena, someone put on a record. It was an old one. The sound filled the room, warm and slightly worn at the edges, the sound of something that had been played many times. Barb, sitting in an armchair with her feet out and a small smile, said, "I haven't heard this in 20 years. Grace said, "I put it on. Deal with it." Barb said, "I'm not complaining." Elena listened to the music and looked at the room, the people in it, the light, the warm disorder of a long evening that had been earned through a long day, that had been earned through a long 17 years. She did not feel everything was resolved. It was not. There was no version of this story in which 17 years came back or undone, or adequately addressed by the fact of being here now. The record of what had happened was permanent. The cost was real and always would be. But she was here, and what was here was real too. She picked up her mug and settled back in her chair. The music played. The room was warm. Outside, the pack grounds were quiet in the night, the old trees holding their place as they always had, as they would continue to do long after every person in this room was gone. It was enough. For this evening, it was exactly enough. The following morning, Cale and Riven met with Darian one more time. This was not in the meeting plan. It had come up the previous evening, at the end of the reception, when Darian had found Cale briefly and asked, simply and without any particular drama, whether he could have a few minutes with both of them at some point, before they were fully into the transition work. He had said it would not take long. He said he just had something he needed to say. Cale had said tomorrow morning. Darian had said all right. They met in the same small room. Darian came in already speaking, which was unusual for him. He was a man who had always taken his time to begin. He said, "I'm not going to ask you to involve me in the transition beyond the role we've discussed. I'm clear about what that role is, and I'll stay in it." He paused. "What I wanted to say is about your mother." He looked at the table. He said, "I'm not going to approach her. I made that choice and I'm holding to it. She decides whether there is anything between us going forward, and I don't ask for anything or expect anything." He said it flat and complete, the way people say things when they have rehearsed them enough that the emotion is still there but the delivery is under control. "But I wanted you to know that I understand, now, what she built while she was gone, what she put into you, both of you. And I know that what you are, who you are, the quality of your thinking, and your judgment, and yourselves." He stopped. "I know that's from her. That's what she did. In 17 years, with nothing, she made you. I know that." He was quiet. Riven said, "We know it too." Darian looked at him. Riven said, "She knows you know. She has always known you were capable of understanding what she was, which is part of why your choice hurt the way it did." He said it without cruelty but with precision. "Telling us doesn't change what happened, but it's worth saying." Darian said, "Yes." There was a silence. Cale said, "She doesn't need anything from you. You should understand that. Not absolution, not acknowledgement, not anything. She is completely fine. What she built is completely solid. You didn't destroy anything fundamental in her. You changed her circumstances, and she built something from the new circumstances. That's who she is, and that's what she did." He said it not unkindly. He said it because it was true, and because he suspected that Darian had been carrying something that was in part about guilt and in part about imagining what he had done to her as larger and more permanent than it actually was, and that imagining it as a permanent destruction was, paradoxically, a way of making himself the most significant force in her life, which he was not. Darian absorbed this. He said, "I know she doesn't need anything from me." Cale said, "Good." They sat for another minute. Then they all stood, and the three of them shook hands, which was not something any of them had planned, but which happened in the natural way of a thing whose time has come, and Darian left the room first. Cale and Riven sat back down. Riven said, "He's going to do the historian role well." Cale said, "Probably. He understands the archive instinctively. Philip said so." Riven said, "Philip would know." A pause. Cale said, "Are you actually feeling all right?" Riven looked at him. He said, "I have complicated feelings that are organizing themselves. I'm functional, and clear-headed about the work. The complicated feelings are running in a different lane." Cale said, "That's healthy." Riven said, "I know it is." Another silence. Riven said, "He's not what I expected." Cale said, "People rarely are." Riven said, "No. I mean, I expected someone who had made his peace with what he did by convincing himself it was right. I expected the kind of person who had reorganized the truth to be comfortable over 17 years. He didn't do that. He just sat in the wrong thing, without ever fully letting himself look at it." Cale said, "Is that better or worse, in your view?" Riven thought. He said, "It's more human." He said it like that was the answer. And perhaps it was. They went to find their mother. She was in the garden. She had been there for an hour, she said, and she had been thinking that the lavender she had planted in the first year, the row of it along the south-facing wall, was still there. It had spread considerably. She was kneeling beside it with her hand in the soil. She looked up when they came through the gate. She said, "Come and see this." They came and looked. The lavender was old and sprawling, and had clearly not been touched in a long time, which had allowed it to grow into something considerably more individual and weather-worn than lavender usually is. It smelled extraordinary in the morning air. Elena said, "I planted this in my 3rd month here. I didn't know if I was staying. I planted it anyway, because I have always found that planting something is the best possible argument for staying anywhere." Cale said, "Are you staying now?" She looked at him. She looked around at the garden, at the old walls, at the morning light in the old trees. She said, "I'm going to divide my time. This pack needs me accessible, and my life is also where I built it. Both things are true, and both things can coexist." Riven said, "That's a very diplomatic answer." She said, "It's a very honest answer. I'm allowed to have a complicated relationship with a complicated place." He said, "Fair enough." She stood up and brushed the soil from her hands. She looked at both of them, her sons, 17 years old, co-alphas of a pack they had grown up outside of, young people who carried the weight of something enormous, with the particular ease of people who have been preparing for it their whole lives, without knowing that was what they were doing. She said, "I'm proud of you." She said it simply, without ceremony. The way she said things, she meant completely. Cale said, "We know." She said, "That's not the point of saying it. The point is that you should hear it from me, directly." Riven said, "We hear it." She nodded. She said, "Good. Now, Cale, you need to call Helen about the Eastern Territory before end of day or the window closes. And Riven, Derek's schedule for the training program review is on your desk." Cale said, "I know." Riven said, "I know." She said, "So why are you standing in the garden?" They looked at each other. They went inside. Elena stayed in the garden for another minute. She turned her face up to the morning light, which was the good clean light of an early autumn morning, full and direct and warm on her skin. She breathed in the lavender. She thought, "I am here. This is real. All of it." Then she went inside too. The year that followed was the hardest and the best. It was hard in the way that real work is hard. Not dramatically, not with the sharp edges of crisis, but with the sustained, daily weight of people trying to do something complex right, in a community that was still finding its new shape, with systems that were still being built and tested and sometimes revised, when the first design turned out to be imperfect. Cale revised the council conflict resolution mechanism twice in the first year. He was not troubled by this. He would have been troubled if he had not needed to revise it, because systems that require no adjustment after contact with reality are not operating in reality. Riven rebuilt the training program from scratch. He and Derek worked on it together over 3 weeks, both of them bringing their different knowledge to the table. Derek's 20 years inside the pack's physical culture, and Riven's outsider's understanding of what was missing and what was needed. The program they built was demanding in the way of good programs. It asked a great deal of people, but always asked them towards something real. Participation was voluntary, but Riven had understood, from watching communities his whole life, that genuinely good things do not need to be mandatory. Within 2 months, participation in the training program was at 70% of eligible pack members. Within 4 months, it was at 90%. Derek said to Riven, one afternoon after a session, "You know what you're doing in a room." Riven said, "I learned from watching people who knew what they were doing in a room." Derek said, "Your mother." Riven said, "Mostly her." Derek looked at him. He said, "She came to watch the program last week. I didn't know she was there until afterward. She didn't make herself obvious." Riven said, "She never does." Derek said, "She told me, afterward, that the way the program was structured reminded her of something she had wanted to build when she was Luna, and never had time to." He paused. "She seemed not sad about it, just aware of it." Riven said, "That's how she is about most of it." Derek said, "She's remarkable." Riven said, "Yes, she is." Elena had found her rhythm in the pack by the 3rd month. She had not assumed a formal title. There had been a discussion about whether to formally restore the Luna title, and she had declined it. She said the pack had 2 alphas and that was enough, and that what she was interested in doing did not require a title. What she was interested in doing was working with the pack members who existed at the margins of the formal structure. The wolves, who had come through difficult periods, the rogue wolves, who occasionally sought pack affiliation after years outside any structure, the younger members, who were struggling with the transition from one kind of pack culture to another. She set up a small advisory function that had no official name and no formal standing, and that became, within 6 months, one of the most used resources in the pack. People came to her at all hours. She kept an open door, and she was almost always in. Grace, who watched this development with the satisfaction of a person whose long-held assessments are being continuously confirmed, told Harold that Elena had always been a Luna in the original sense of the word. Not the title, not the ceremonial position, but the actual function of someone who holds the center of a community by paying genuine attention to everyone in it. Harold said he wished they had understood this 17 years ago. Grace said, "You understood it. You chose the easier thing." Harold looked at her. He said, "You've been waiting to say that." Grace said, "I've been waiting a long time for it to be appropriate." The Eastern Territory relationship with Helen took 3 months to rebuild, which was exactly how long Cale had calculated it would take. Helen was, as Darian had said, fair and relationship-driven, and she needed to see the new structure in operation before she was willing to extend the same trust that she had extended to the previous arrangement. She met with Cale twice, and with Riven once, and with Elena separately, the last of which had not been planned, but which Elena had proposed, and which had turned out to be the meeting that mattered most. Helen and Elena had spoken for 2 hours on a rainy afternoon in a neutral location. Cale did not know everything they had discussed. He had not asked. Whatever had been said had resulted in Helen calling him the following morning and saying that she was ready to formalize the territorial agreement in writing, which had previously been her main hesitation, and that she felt confident about the relationship going forward. He had thanked her. She had said, "Your mother is an extraordinary person." He had said, "I know." Pete, the young wolf who had abstained in the council vote, formally withdrew his abstention 8 months into the co-regency. He did it in writing, with a brief statement attached that said he had observed the co-alpha structure operating in practice, and that his concerns about inherent weakness had not been borne out, and that he was withdrawing the abstention to reflect his current assessment. He sent it to Harold, and copied Cale and Riven. Cale wrote back a 1-line reply that said thank you for the update, and that he was glad the structure was working. Pete replied to say he still had reservations about the 48-hour dispute window, and that he was watching it closely. Cale replied to say he should keep watching, and to let him know if he observed anything worth adjusting. It was the beginning of a productive ongoing conversation. Darian, in the historian role, proved to be exactly as good at it as Riven had predicted, and exactly as quietly present as he had been since the transition began. He came to the archive every day, the same archive room where the folder of forged documents had once been kept, and where Cord had stood, looking at the empty sleeve. He worked methodically through decades of pack records, organizing and cataloging, and in some cases, digitizing materials that had been stored in ways that made them vulnerable. Philip, who heard about this from his network and who visited the pack 3 months into the transition to consult on the archive organization, spent an afternoon with Darian, going through the cataloging system. He reported to Cale afterward that Darian was thorough and that he understood the value of what he was doing. Cale asked, "How did he seem?" Philip thought about it, he said, like a man who is doing something useful with the time he has left. Cale said, "Good." Darian sent one letter to Elena. He sent it through Cale, with a note to Cale that said he was not asking Cale to facilitate a response or to advocate for its receipt. He was simply asking whether Cale would pass it along. He said Elena could decide entirely independently what to do with it, and that his expectation was nothing. Cale gave it to Elena without comment. She read it. She told Cale she had read it when he asked. She did not tell him what was in it. He did not ask. She put it in the box with the original forgery documents, the box she kept in the room she used when she stayed at the pack. She locked the box. 2 weeks later, she and Darian passed each other in the East Wing corridor. He stopped. She stopped. They looked at each other for a moment. She said, "Darian." He said, "Elena." She said, "The archive looks good. Philip told me." He said, "Philip is generous. There's still a lot to do." She said, "There always is." They looked at each other for another moment. There was a great deal in that moment. 17 years, 2 sons. a life built from loss, an archive full of history that was being organized and preserved. There was the morning in the hall and the walk out through the gates and the cold and the $40 and everything that had followed. There was also just two people in a corridor on an ordinary Tuesday who knew each other better than almost anyone else in the world knew either of them. She said, "Take care of yourself." He said, "You too." She walked on. He watched her go. He stood in the corridor for a moment after she had turned the corner, and then he went back to the archive. The first anniversary of Elena's return was not marked officially. She had been clear that she did not want it marked. She had said to Grace, when Grace had proposed something small, "The anniversary of being restored to a place I should never have left is not something I need to celebrate. I'd rather mark it by having done something useful on that day." She spent the day working. Cale and Riven both happened to be in the building and happened to share the meal that evening with her, which was not a celebration and was not unremarkable either. It was a meal, with food Grace had made and wine that nobody acknowledged was nicer than usual, and the four of them sat at the kitchen table and talked about the work and the pack and the things that were still being figured out. Grace said, at one point, "It's been a good year." Elena said, "It's been a hard year." Grace said, "Those aren't different things." Elena looked at her. She said, "No, they're not." They raised their glasses, not dramatically, just quietly, to the table, to the evening, to a year that had been both of those things at once. Outside, the pack grounds were the way they always were in the autumn, the trees turning, the light doing the particular thing that autumn light does in the evening, softening everything into a version of itself that is somehow both more and less real at the same time. Cale looked out the window. He thought about all the things that had been built from the contents of a single wrongful accusation: his mother's discipline, his mother's networks, his own years of study, Riven's years of training, Grace's patience, Philip's specific expertise, a chain of people going back through Owen Marsh, and Arthur, and Carol, and every ordinary person who had done the right small thing, at the right moment. He thought about how a lie tends to produce its own undoing, not because justice is automatic, it is not, and he knew it was not, but because a lie is a gap in the structure of things, and gaps produce instability, and instability eventually produces collapse, if there is anyone with the intelligence and the patience to wait for the moment and to be ready when it comes. They had been ready. His mother had made them ready. He looked at her across the table, this woman who had walked out into the dark with $40 and a choice to survive in a way that would matter, and who had done precisely that, and who was now sitting in a kitchen in a pack that had once driven her out, drinking good wine with her sons and her ally, discussing the work of the next period with the practical attention of someone who intends to still be doing this for a very long time. He thought, "She is the most remarkable person I have ever known." He thought this not for the first time, and not for the last. It was simply true, one of the true things he had known all his life, as reliable as anything else he had ever counted on. Riven, across the table, caught his eye. Riven said nothing. He raised his glass very slightly. Cale raised his. Elena noticed this exchange, because she noticed everything. She looked at them both. She said, "What?" Cale said, "Nothing." Riven said, "Nothing at all." She looked at them for a moment, with the expression she had always made when she knew they were being deliberately uncommunicative and had decided it was not worth the effort to press. Then she turned back to Grace and resumed the conversation. Cale and Riven looked at each other across the table. Something passed between them that was not a word and did not need to be. The particular communication of people who have been in the same world since before they could speak, who have grown up beside each other, who have built something enormous together, and are now on the other side of the building of it, and can see it standing. Outside the window, the evening was doing what evenings do. The light changed. The pack was quiet. The trees held their ground. Somewhere in the building, in a room with a window that looked out at those same trees, a man was working methodically through decades of history, organizing it carefully, making it accessible, doing the useful thing with the time he had. And in the garden along the south-facing wall, the lavender that Elena had planted in her third month in the pack, 34 years ago now, was doing what lavender does in autumn, putting itself away quietly, storing everything it needed to survive the cold, preparing without fuss for the spring it had already decided to reach. It had survived a great deal. It would survive a great deal more. That was the nature of things that were planted with care, in good soil, by someone who understood that planting something is the best possible argument for staying. The evening settled. The kitchen was warm. There was still more to do. There was always more to do. But for tonight, exactly this was enough. In the months that followed the anniversary, the pack continued its work of becoming something new. New was not entirely the right word. The pack was old. Its roots went back generations, through histories that predated anyone currently living in it. What it was becoming was not new in the sense of built from scratch, but new in the sense of redirected, like a river that finds a cleaner course, still the same water, still carrying the same force, but moving differently through the landscape. Cale spent the second year deepening the structural reforms. The council oversight mechanism, once it had been running long enough to produce real data about its own function, showed him 3 places where the original design had been too theoretical, places where the way he had imagined people would behave inside the structure, and the way they actually behaved were not the same. He adjusted each one, not dramatically but precisely, the way a careful builder adjusts a thing when the actual load reveals something the model missed. He also, in the second year, began working with Francis on a written legal guide to PAC member rights and evidence proceedings. It was a practical document, not an academic one, something that a PAC member with no legal background could read and understand and use. He took it through 7 drafts before he was satisfied with the clarity of it. Francis said the 7th draft was as clear as anything she had encountered in PAC law, and that she intended to distribute it to her network. Cale said that was the point of it. Riven, in the second year, expanded the training program to include a component that had not been in the original design, a mentorship structure that paired senior wolves with younger ones, not for physical training specifically, but for the broader kind of development that physical training opens a door to. He had observed, in the first year, that the best moments in the training sessions were often not the training itself, but what happened around it, the conversations, the relationships, the specific kind of trust that builds between people who have been difficult things together in a structured environment. He built a structure around those moments. Derek said it was the smartest thing Riven had done since starting the program. Riven said, "It's not smart, I just watched what was working and built more of it." Derek said, "That is what smart looks like." Pete became, over the second year, one of the more active council members. His reservations did not disappear. He remained watchful, and was not inclined to approve things without genuine scrutiny. But his scrutiny was productive rather than obstructive, and Cale found himself, increasingly, looking for Pete's question before presenting anything to the council, because Pete's question was usually the one that identified whatever he had not fully accounted for. He told Pete this at one point. Pete said he was aware, and that it was not going to make him softer. Cale said he did not want him softer. Pete said, "Good." Grace turned 80 in the second year. The pack celebrated this with a gathering that was not formal but was very full, people arriving throughout the evening with food and small gifts, and the particular warmth of community, assembled around someone who has been its center for a very long time. Elena organized a large part of it, quietly, in the way she organized things, making phone calls, arranging logistics, ensuring that the things that needed to happen happened without any of the visible machinery. Grace, who was not someone who was easily moved, was moved. She sat in the center of the gathering, in the largest chair the kitchen had, which had been there for as long as anyone could remember, and which had an air of having been specifically Grace's property for at least 40 years, and she looked at the people in the room with an expression that Elena recognized, the expression of someone who has lived long enough to reach the other side of the worst things, and who is sitting in the warmth of what survived. Grace caught Elena's eye across the room. Elena raised her glass. Grace said nothing. She simply looked at her for a moment, with everything she did not need words for. Then she turned to the person beside her, and laughed at something that person said, and was in the party again. Barb, standing near Elena, said, "She's going to outlive us all." Elena said, "Certainly." Barb said, "I'm fine with that." They both looked at Grace. Elena said, "So am I." The lavender was extraordinary, in the spring of the second year. It bloomed earlier than usual, responding to a warm March that nobody had predicted. and it came in with such density and color that the garden smelled like itself from 50 feet away. Several pack members independently remarked on it. 2 people asked Elena where to get cuttings. She showed them how to take them properly, kneeling in the garden with her hands in the soil and 2 people crouching beside her learning. And she said that lavender needed almost no help once it was established. It was one of those plants that rewards patience and basic care, and very little else. One of the 2 people, a young woman named Lucy, said she had never gardened before. Elena said, "That's fine. You start somewhere. You try. It either grows or it doesn't. But either way, you learn something." Lucy said, "And if it dies?" Elena said, "You plant another one." She said it simply, as a fact about gardening, and about nothing else in particular. Lucy nodded, and took her cutting, and went to plant it. Elena stayed in the garden for a while afterward. She was not a woman who spent a great deal of time looking backward. It was not her nature, and even if it had been, she had too much present tense in her life to spend much energy on the past. But the garden was a place where the past and the present existed simultaneously, in a way she found useful rather than painful. The lavender she was kneeling beside was the same lavender from 34 years ago. The trees beyond the garden wall were the same trees. The wall itself was the same wall. She was not the same person she had been when she planted the lavender. She was better. Not better in the sense of having healed from damage, though there had been damage, and she had healed from it, mostly, in the way that people heal from real things, which is to say incompletely and successfully at the same time. Better in the sense of having been built up by everything that had happened, including the things that had tried to diminish her, which had not, in the end, accomplished that. She thought about the 17-year-old version of herself who had first come to this pack. That young woman had been brave, and kind, and genuinely good, and she had loved with a completeness that was a quality, rather than a vulnerability, and she had trusted without sufficient basis, which was a mistake, rather than a character flaw, and the mistake had cost her an enormous amount. She did not regret being that person. She was glad she had been that person, because that person had become this person, and this person was someone she was, on most days and in the most fundamental ways, at peace with being. She brushed the soil from her hands. She thought about Cale at his desk, working. She thought about Riven in the training yard, building something. She thought about Owen, who had called last month just to say hello, and who had said that things sounded like they were going well, and she had said yes. And there had been a pause, and then he had said, simply, "Good," and they had talked about other things, and the word had been the right word, clean and full. She thought about the metal box under the bed in the room she kept at the pack. She thought about the documents in it, the originals and the forgeries and the archivist's statement and Darian's letter, all of it together in the same container, a record of everything that had been done against her and everything that had been done to set it right, side by side. She thought, that is the right place for it. She stood up. She looked at the lavender. She said, to no one in particular, "Good job." Then she went inside, to where her sons were working, to where her life was, to where the next thing was waiting to be done. The doors were open. The morning was good. There was always more to do. And she intended to do all of it.